Story 1. The Candle Thieves of Colonial Boston. In the middle of the 18th century, when the streets of Boston flickered dimly with lanterns and household windows cast their faint light into cobblestone alleys, the city was bound by a resource that most of us today scarcely consider: candles. Without them, homes descended into darkness with the setting sun. Candles were not decoration, not luxury. They were necessity. They dictated the rhythms of daily life, the hour a family could read their Bible, the time a merchant might balance his ledger, the means by which midwives attended births in cold back rooms. And yet, as with all things necessary, they invited theft. The crime that quietly gripped colonial Boston was not a bloody affair of highwaymen or duels, but something quieter, more insidious: the stealing of candles. The value of wax and tallow. To understand why a thief might risk reputation and punishment for so humble an item, you need to picture the economics of the candle. In the 1700s, the production of candles required skill and resource. Tallow-rendered animal fat was cheap and common, but it smoked heavily and stank when burned. Beeswax was far superior, burning cleanly and lasting longer, but it was costly, harvested in limited supply from hives kept by only the wealthiest households. In Boston's markets, a pound of beeswax could command a price that made it nearly as dear as imported tea. Candles were commodities, and for the poorer families of the North End or the dockside districts, they represented an expense always at risk of being cut too close. Merchants sold candles in bundles, wrapped in twine. The wealthy stocked cupboards with beeswax tapers, while working families scraped coins together for tallow. Those without either turned to daylight alone, or the dim flame of rushlight's reeds dipped in grease. When a family's candle stores dwindled before the next wage came in, desperation often gave way to theft. Boston's darkened alleys. Boston in the 1740s and 1750s was a city of contradictions. By day, it bustled as a port alive with seafaring commerce, rum distilleries, and noisy markets. By night, its narrow streets sank into shadow. Street lamps were few, and the small patrol of night watchmen could not cover the sprawl of twisting lanes. Darkness gave cover to more than drunks or mischief-makers. It was in those hours that candles slipped from cupboards, storehouses, and merchant stalls. Thieves did not storm into homes. More often, they slipped in quietly, unnoticed until morning revealed what was missing. A family would wake, stumble toward the cupboard, and find the bundles gone. What was stolen was not gold, not silver, but light itself. Imagine it. You, as a householder in Boston, have just enough candles to last through the coming week. One morning, you open the wooden chest where you keep them and find the space empty. The shutters remain latched, the doors untouched. But the wax is gone. There is no proof of intrusion save for that yawning absence. And when night falls again, you are left in darkness. The first reports. Boston newspapers of the era, like the Boston Gazette and the New England Weekly Journal, occasionally printed curious tidbits about thefts considered too minor for court, but too strange to ignore. In 1742, one notice recorded the pilfering of wax lights from the shop of a Mr. G on King Street. The editor wryly nodding that the thief favors neither coin nor cloth, but pursues the humbler treasure of wax. The language might seem amused, but beneath it lay frustration. Merchants saw losses add up, while families feared nights spent in darkness. Court records from Suffolk County show scattered cases involving candle theft. These were rarely grand trials, but instead small hearings in which an accused, often a servant, sailor, or apprentice, was brought forward by their master or employer. The crime might seem trivial to us, but in the 18th century, theft of necessity was treated with severity. A servant caught with his master's candles could expect whipping, branding, or worse. The suspects who stole candles. The records point to several types of culprits. Some were desperate laborers, men who had been laid off from shipyards or whose wages were withheld. Unable to buy their own supply, they slipped into storehouses and carried away bundles under their coats. Others were servants, Domestic service in Boston households meant proximity to goods but little pay. A maid tasked with trimming wicks and preparing wax for evening prayers might pocket a taper or two, tucking it into her apron. A bundle might vanish over weeks, piece by piece. There were also children. Colonial children worked hard, but they also knew the value of play after sunset. A boy caught stealing candles in 1751 admitted he had done so to make lanterns with the other lads. In the telling, you can hear both mischief and necessity. Light extended their world beyond dusk. The merchant's response. Merchants were not blind to these losses. Candle makers, especially those on Newbury Street and by the wharves, began to lock their storerooms with heavier chains. Notices were placed in papers offering small rewards for information. A Mr. William Denny, in 1756, advertised that any person giving intelligence of the theft of wax candles from my store shall be handsomely rewarded. But candle theft was slippery. The stolen goods could be burned within a night. Unlike stolen silver or a horse, candles left little evidence. A taper lit in a poor man's home was indistinguishable from one bought honestly. Prosecution depended on being caught in the act, which was rare. The watchman and the glow. Night watchmen, patrolling with lanterns and rattles, began to notice a pattern. In certain alleys, the glow of light seemed suspiciously abundant in homes where poverty suggested otherwise. Reports trickled in, neighbors whispering of families who burned wax tapers though they could never afford them. Servants observed slipping bundles to acquaintances. Still, evidence was thin. Suspicion alone could not justify breaking into a man's home, and even when caught, thieves claimed the candles were gifts or leftovers from a master's generosity. Watchmen struggled, their rounds more symbolic than effective. Candle thieves remained phantoms, their work dissolving into the shadows. The community's fear. To you, as a Bostonian of the time, the candle thefts might seem small compared to smuggling or armed robbery. Yet there was unease. A home without candles was vulnerable to injury, to fear, to isolation. Light was safety. Its loss was felt deeply. Imagine winter, the cold pressing through the shutters, the sun setting before supper. Without candles, your family gathers in gloom. A thief who steals wax from your home steals not only a commodity but the very rhythm of your evenings. The crime, small on paper, feels enormous in your lived experience. The community murmured about whether the thefts were random or part of something larger. Were there organized bands of thieves? Or was it simply the symptom of poverty pressing on too many? Newspapers speculated but never proved. A case emerges. In the late 1750s, one case broke the quiet pattern. A shopkeeper on Orange Street reported repeated thefts, bundles disappearing despite new locks. He claimed to have lost nearly 20 pounds of wax within a season, a costly blow. Determined to uncover the thief, he enlisted neighbors and watchmen to lay a trap. One cold evening, they concealed themselves in the shadows across from his store. Hours passed. Midnight drew on. Then, at last, a figure appeared, not a ragged sailor or mischievous boy, but a well-dressed man. He carried himself with confidence, slipping a key into the lock as though it were his own. The witnesses leapt forward, startling him. The thief fled, dropping a bundle of candles into the mud, but he was seized by the watch. His identity shocked the neighborhood. He was not poor, nor desperate, but a respected clerk from a counting house on King Street. The question: why would a man of standing risk reputation and punishment for candles he could well afford? Was he feeding a secret market, supplying taverns or smugglers with stolen wax? Or was there some deeper motive, one lost to time? The case set Boston whispering, but the trial, when it came, revealed less than it promised. Records survive only in fragments. The clerk's name is noted, but the sentence remains unclear. And so you are left, standing in the shadow of that stolen glow, asking, was candle theft truly a crime of desperation, or did it mask something more deliberate, perhaps even organized? When the well-dressed clerk of King Street was caught with wax bundles spilling into the mud, the quiet world of candle theft suddenly seemed larger, more tangled. What had once been dismissed as petty pilfering, the kind of crime hidden in servant gossip or the corners of newspapers, was now the subject of sermons, tavern chatter, and official concern. If a man of good repute could be drawn into such theft, what did that say about Boston's order? The question of motive. The clerk's case raised immediate questions. He earned a respectable wage, his position placed him among the city's aspiring middle class. Yet he had risked it all. During questioning, he offered no clear motive. Some suggested drink had loosened his sense. Others believed greed had hardened it. But there were darker rumors, ones that tied his crime to something more organized, a hidden market for stolen wax. Unlike coin or cloth, candles could vanish into smoke, leaving no trace. But what if they weren't vanishing at all? What if bundles were being traded, resold, and dispersed through taverns, inns, and even ships leaving the harbor? It is here that the story takes on the shape of something larger, less a series of desperate thefts, and more a network. Boston's black market. Boston in the mid-18th century was a trading city. Rum, sugar, and molasses came and went with ships from the Caribbean. Smuggling was rampant. Contraband tea, cloth, and brandy moved through secret channels, overseen by merchants who smiled politely in daylight while cutting deals in the shadows. Against this backdrop, it was not hard to imagine a smaller black market in necessities. Candle theft fit neatly into this hidden economy. Taverns in poorer quarters needed light but balked at the price of wax. Ships setting sail might stock cheaper stolen goods if it meant shaving costs. Even wealthier households, eager to save a shilling, could look the other way if their supply came from less than honest sources. The idea unsettled the community. A candle stolen from your cupboard might not simply vanish into the night. It might be burning in a tavern down the street, lighting the dice of gamblers or the hands of smugglers counting coin. The investigative turn. Boston's watchmen, usually a sleepy force with rattles and lanterns, began to look closer. The case of the clerk became a rallying point. Watch captains ordered their men to check suspicious movements near storehouses. Merchants lobbied magistrates to take losses more seriously. Records show that in 1760, a small investigative committee was formed, an unusual step for a crime so minor. This committee of inquiry included merchants, a constable, and 2 selectmen. Their mission was simple: trace where the candles were going. Following the wax. The committee's strategy was patient, almost mundane. They did not chase thieves through alleys. Instead, they followed the goods. They began visiting taverns, counting the candles burning in rooms, asking for receipts or names of suppliers. Some tavern keepers bristled at the intrusion, insisting their wax was bought lawfully. Others, under pressure, admitted to deals struck at odd hours, with men they did not know by name. One tavern near the wharf confessed to buying bundles at half the market rate. The seller, described as a sailor with a scarred cheek, had returned several times, always with the same kind of wax tapers. From this lead, the inquiry traced sales to other taverns, revealing a pattern: candles moving quietly through Boston's underbelly, exchanged for coin and rum. The faces behind the trade. What emerged was not a single culprit but a web. Sailors off ships sold candles stolen from warehouses. Apprentices slipped bundles from their masters' stores. Servants smuggled tapers out under aprons. These small thefts, added together, became a steady supply. One name appeared again and again in testimonies: Samuel Pike, a former chandler's apprentice turned petty trader. Pike had been dismissed years earlier for dishonesty, yet he remained in Boston, frequenting taverns and selling goods at suspiciously low prices. Witnesses described him carrying wax bundles in sacks, offering them to innkeepers and sailors preparing to depart. Pike was never caught in the act of theft, but suspicions clung to him. He seemed less a thief himself and more a broker, a man who took goods from others, and placed them into the black market stream. The fear of organization. The idea of a broker unsettled the committee. A single thief could be punished, a servant could be whipped, a sailor jailed. But a system, one in which many small hands fed goods into a central figure, was harder to stop. For you, as a Bostonian hearing whispers of Pike's name, the story takes on a sharper edge. It is no longer about a missing taper in your cupboard. It is about an unseen network profiting off necessities, eroding the fragile trust of neighbors. If candles could be stolen in such numbers, what else might vanish? Flour, cloth, even coin. Punishments and warnings. Magistrates began to make examples of those caught. In 1761, a servant convicted of candle theft was sentenced to public whipping at the town whipping post. Notices of his punishment were spread in papers, warning others. Another man, a sailor, was branded with a T for theft on his hand after being found with bundles hidden in his sea chest. Yet even as punishments grew harsher, the thefts did not cease. Instead, they became more careful, more deliberate. Wax was stolen in smaller amounts, dispersed more widely. The network adjusted, as living things do when threatened. The community's unease. The more the committee investigated, the more ordinary Bostonians felt the weight of unease. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. A house burning wax tapers might be whispered about. Could they afford those honestly? Taverns lit late into the night might be accused of feeding off the black market. Candles, once symbols of warmth and safety, became markers of potential guilt. To light your home was to invite scrutiny. To sit in darkness was to suffer fear. The balance of trust in the community eroded, one taper at a time. A curious disappearance. In 1762, just as the committee began to close in on Pike, something strange happened. He vanished. One day he was seen near the wharf, bargaining with sailors. The next he was gone. No record survives of his departure. No trial, no punishment, no burial. Some said he boarded a ship and sailed south, carrying his trade with him. Others claimed he had been quietly bought off by merchants who preferred his disappearance to a scandalous trial. A few whispered darker rumors that he had been silenced by rivals, buried in some shallow grave outside town. Whatever the truth, Pike's absence left the city with unanswered questions. Was the candle trade dismantled with his departure, or did it simply slip underground, carried on by smaller hands in his place? The Great Fire and the Lightless Night. In March of 1763, Boston was struck by a devastating fire that consumed over 300 buildings. In the aftermath, candle theft all but disappeared from newspapers and records, swallowed by the larger crisis. Families who had once whispered about stolen wax now faced the destruction of their homes entirely. And yet, even then, the question of candles lingered. The fire itself had been lit, it was said, by a careless spark in a workshop, some claimed even by a stolen candle. The irony was bitter. The very object whose theft had haunted Boston for years may have played a role in the city's greatest calamity. The cliffhanger. By the mid-1760s, Boston was on the edge of revolution. Political pamphlets filled the air, and talk of independence drowned out stories of stolen wax. But in the quieter corners of memory, people remembered the candle thieves. Some even swore that the black market for necessities born in shadows, tested in wax, laid the groundwork for the smuggling networks that would later fuel rebellion. By the time Boston marched toward revolution in the late 1760s, candle theft had become a memory whispered in kitchens, taverns, and parish meetings. The quiet crime that once unsettled households now seemed small against the roar of politics. Yet it is worth lingering with it, because those thefts of something as ordinary as wax and tallow reveal much about a society wrestling with poverty, trust, and the thin line between necessity and crime. The trials and their lessons. The surviving court records, though scattered, tell the end of the story in pieces. A sailor sentenced to branding, a servant whipped, an apprentice dismissed and barred from guild entry. These punishments, harsh by today's standards, were meant not merely to correct but to terrify. Public whipping posts and scarred hands reminded the community that even petty theft would not be tolerated. And yet, the very need for such punishments revealed the limits of the law. The court could humiliate a servant, but it could not erase hunger. It could brand a sailor, but it could not fix the uneven wages of shipwork. The thefts had not sprung from villainy alone, they were the symptoms of a fragile economy in which survival sometimes demanded theft. The Candlemakers' Guild. Boston's candlemakers themselves took lessons from those years. In 1765, a group of chandlers petitioned for stronger guild protections, citing losses to pilferage and unlawful trade. They argued that candle theft harmed not only households, but also the honest tradesmen whose work sustained the city. Some guild records show experiments in marking candles with distinctive cuts or dyes, crude efforts to distinguish legitimate goods from stolen ones. Others proposed closer cooperation with constables to monitor stores. Though not all measures succeeded, they reflected an early recognition that security and commerce were intertwined. The social divide. If you walked Boston streets in that era, you would notice the divide made visible by candlelight. In the North End, poorer families burned smoky tallow, the air thick with its odor. In the South End, wealthier households glowed with beeswax tapers, steady and sweet-smelling. Light itself marked class. The thefts blurred those lines. When stolen wax burned in a poor home, neighbors gossiped. Did the family suddenly have means? Or were they complicit in the underground trade? Candlelight became a marker not only of wealth but also of suspicion. In this way, the thefts widened mistrust, eroding the fragile bonds that held communities together. The aftermath of Pike's disappearance. The vanishing of Samuel Pike, the suspected broker of the trade, left questions unresolved. Some later accounts, though difficult to verify, suggest he did indeed sail south, perhaps to New York or Charleston, where smuggling networks thrived. In those ports, stolen goods could disappear into larger markets, far harder to trace. Others insisted Pike had been quietly absorbed into Boston's more respectable mercantile circles, his past overlooked in exchange for his knowledge of underground trade. If so, his story reflects a pattern repeated across history. Today's thief becomes tomorrow's businessman, provided he survives long enough to cross that line. Candles and revolution. It may seem strange, but the memory of stolen candles did not vanish entirely. When Boston merchants later resisted British taxes on imported goods, tea, sugar, and molasses, they already knew the value of underground supply. Smuggling was not an abstract act of defiance. It was a familiar practice, one that had once kept taverns lit with stolen wax. You can almost hear the echo. A Bostonian who once bought a taper from Pike's network might later buy smuggled tea with the same whispered transaction. In this way, the candle thefts served as a rehearsal for larger acts of resistance. The line between criminal economy and political rebellion was not always so clear. The fire's symbolism. The Great Fire of 1763, said by some to have been sparked by a candle, left a scar on the city. Hundreds of buildings were lost, and with them, countless households, stores of wax and tallow. The fire became a grim metaphor. The very light that sustained the city could also destroy it. Afterward, regulations on fire safety increased. Families were urged to snuff candles carefully, to store wax in safer places, to restrict burning in workshops. In this way, candle theft faded not only because of investigation, but also because of fear. People began to see candles less as objects to covet and more as dangers to be managed. The human side. Behind the records and rumors were individuals whose names seldom survive. A maid whipped for pocketing her master's tapers. A boy scolded for stealing light for play. A sailor who carried wax across seas, only to be caught at the dock. Their stories are fragments, but they remind you that crime was not abstract, it was lived. Imagine the boy in a cold garret, clutching a taper stolen from a shop, lighting it to chase away the dark. Imagine the servant, her hands trembling as she hides a candle in her apron, knowing that if caught, the punishment will scar her body forever. In these moments, crime ceases to be statistics. It becomes survival, fear, and sometimes rebellion. From wax to gaslight. By the early 19th century, Boston's candle thieves were forgotten, replaced by new stories of gaslight and later electric lamps. The world moved on, and what once seemed precious became quaint, yet the lessons remained. Every age has its version of candle theft, small crimes that reveal larger truths. In Boston's case, the theft of wax illuminated the fragility of communities, the tensions between rich and poor, and the hidden economies that thrive in shadow. Today, the crime may seem almost laughable, but to those who lived it, it was no joke. It was light stolen from the night, a threat to safety, and a reminder that trust was as fragile as flame. Reflection. So what do you make of it? Were the candle thieves desperate men and women, forced by poverty to steal? Or were they opportunists, feeding a hidden market that blurred the lines between survival and greed? Was Pike a petty broker, or the first glimpse of a shadow economy that would later intertwine with revolution? History does not give us neat answers, but it does give us light flickering, incomplete, but enough to see the contours of human behavior. The candle thieves of colonial Boston remind us that even the humblest crime can reveal a city's soul. Closing thought. And so the story ends where it began, with a city in darkness, lit only by flame. In those flames, whether stolen, bought, or smuggled, Boston's people saw their hopes, their fears, and their survival. And you are left with the final question. When we look back at history's small crimes, are we seeing petty theft, or the first sparks of something far larger? Story 2. The Milk Bottle Poisonings of London, 1920s. The milkman was as ordinary a sight in London as the morning fog. Each day, horse-drawn carts rattled down narrow streets and bottles clinked as they were set on stoops, ready to be taken in by housewives before breakfast. In the early 1920s, this routine was so entrenched that people scarcely thought about it. Milk arrived, cool and pale in the glass, and life went on. But for a short, unsettling stretch of years, this most ordinary ritual became a vector of fear. Residents of London began to whisper about the milk bottles not as nourishment, but as silent carriers of death. The setting, post-war London. The Great War had ended only a few years before. London, scarred by the losses of 1914-1918, was trying to steady itself. Food shortages lingered. Inflation bit at families. In poorer districts, mothers stretched rations, making a single pint of milk last across meals. Children relied on it, their growth tied to those pale bottles. It was precisely this dependency that made the rumors so terrifying. What if the very thing meant to nourish could kill? The first suspicious death. The first reports came from Brixton in 1922. A young mother, Mrs. Alice P., poured milk into her infant's cup. Within hours, both she and her child were vomiting violently. The infant did not survive. The coroner's report noted traces of arsenic in the milk, though the source was unclear. At first, it was dismissed as contamination at the dairy. Accidents were not unheard of. Rat poison was kept near feed mills, and sloppy handling could be lethal. The newspapers ran brief columns. Brixton tragedy, milk contamination suspected. People grieved, then returned to routine. But soon other deaths followed. In Hackney, an elderly couple perished after their breakfast tea, the milk later found to contain strychnine. In Stepney, a schoolboy collapsed after drinking cocoa. In each case, the common thread was the milk bottle. Panic and speculation. You must imagine how this felt to an ordinary Londoner in 1923. You step out to your stoop in the gray dawn, retrieve the bottle with its familiar foil top, and set it on the kitchen table. You've done this every day for years, But now, as you pour it into tea, you hesitate. Neighbors whisper, is it safe? Did someone tamper with the bottle? Could the poisoner be among us? Rumors bloomed. Some claimed Bolsheviks were behind it, spreading chaos. Others suspected disgruntled dairy workers. Still others imagined a deranged individual, striking at random, hidden behind the anonymity of glass bottles left unguarded on every doorstep in the city. The police investigation begins. Scotland Yard was pulled into the matter reluctantly. Poisoning cases were notoriously difficult, the substances invisible, the trails cold. Yet the string of deaths demanded action. Detectives began tracing each poisoned bottle back to dairies, checking delivery routes, questioning milkmen. The pattern frustrated them. Some poisoned bottles came from large dairies, others from small local suppliers. Some routes overlapped, others did not. No single dairy was to blame. This pointed not to industrial contamination, but to tampering after the milk left the dairy somewhere along the delivery chain. That realization shifted suspicion toward the milkmen themselves. Suspicion of the milkmen. The milkman was a fixture of trust. Families left coins on the step, knowing the bottles would be delivered honestly. For decades, they had been part of the social fabric. But now, detectives began asking, could one of them be the poisoner? Some were questioned at length. One man in Islington admitted he had opportunity bottles sat unattended on carts for minutes at a time. Another confessed to bitterness toward his employer but denied any role in poisonings. Yet none could be tied directly to the deaths. And still the deaths continued. A pattern emerges. By late 1923, investigators noticed something peculiar. The poisoned bottles were rarely the first on the route. Instead, they appeared at random stops, sometimes near the end. This suggested that the milkman was not the culprit, or at least not the only one. It suggested tampering after delivery. Neighbors began watching each other's steps. Housewives lingered at curtains, scanning the street for strangers. Children were warned not to touch bottles until adults checked them. Yet even with vigilance, the deaths went on. Theories in the press. London newspapers seized the story. The Daily Mirror ran headlines, "Death in the Milk Bottle City Alarmed." The Times published cautious editorials urging calm, while tabloids fueled panic with lurid illustrations of skulls floating above milk glasses. Theories abounded. Some journalists suggested a criminal gang extorting dairies, poisoning bottles to send warnings. Others speculated about disgruntled chemists, angry at their low wages. A few hinted at the work of a serial killer, though the phrase itself was not yet common. For you, as a reader in 1924, the stories would have stirred unease every morning as you reached for that bottle. Would today's glass be safe, or would it hold a hidden dose of arsenic? The first arrest. In early 1924, police finally made an arrest. A man named Henry Lambert, a dismissed dairy worker, was found carrying small vials of arsenic. He had once been employed cleaning machinery at a dairy, but had been fired for drunkenness. Detectives tied him loosely to 2 poisoned bottles found near his former route. His trial drew crowds. In court, the prosecution painted him as vengeful, a man who sought to punish his former employer by sowing chaos. The defense countered that no direct evidence linked him to the actual bottles, only possession of poison. After days of testimony, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Lambert was sentenced to life imprisonment. Newspapers declared the case solved. London breathed easier. But within months, more poisonings occurred. Doubts return. The conviction of Lambert now seemed hasty, perhaps even a miscarriage of justice. If he was behind bars, how could new bottles test positive for strychnine? Police scrambled to reassure the public, suggesting copycats had emerged, inspired by Lambert's trial. But the damage was done. Confidence in the investigation collapsed. The milk bottle had become a symbol of distrust, and Londoners began boiling every drop, some even abandoning milk altogether. The cliffhanger. By 1925, poisoning slowed but never fully stopped. Some believed the true culprit was still at large, operating quietly, beyond the grasp of Scotland Yard. Others insisted the whole affair had been exaggerated by newspapers, with scattered cases of contamination woven into a narrative of murder. The truth remained murky, but the fear was real. And you are left with the pressing question. If Lambert was not the true poisoner, then who was tampering with London's milk bottles and why? By the spring of 1925, London lived with a quiet unease. The war was behind them, rationing had eased, but the milk bottle, that most ordinary presence on every doorstep, still carried the stain of suspicion. People boiled it, sniffed it, tested it in tea before giving it to children. Housewives watched for discoloration, though poison left no mark. Milk was supposed to be nourishment, but it had become a gamble. Lambert behind bars, and yet Henry Lambert's imprisonment had been meant as an ending. His name appeared in the Daily Chronicle with the triumphant headline, "Milk Poisoner Caught London Safe Again." But weeks after his conviction, a child in Camden died after drinking cocoa laced with strychnine, and two elderly sisters in Bethnal Green fell ill with arsenic poisoning. Bottles tested positive. The city asked the obvious: how could Lambert, locked away in Wandsworth Prison, still be poisoning the milk? Detectives muttered about copycats. The press wondered if Lambert had accomplices, men still free and carrying on his work. Scotland Yard's confidence faltered. To many Londoners, it seemed as though the wrong man had been punished. Scotland Yard's dilemma. Poisoning was one of the most difficult crimes to investigate in the 1920s. No fingerprints on a bottle could reveal who had tampered with it. No witnesses ever saw the moment of poisoning. The bottles were left exposed on stoops in the early dawn, vulnerable to anyone passing by. Detectives were forced to reconstruct movements after the fact. Which milkman delivered where? Who was seen loitering in the street? Whose grudge might explain the act? But evidence was always circumstantial, dissolving as quickly as the poison in the milk itself. A confidential memo from 1925, preserved in the Metropolitan Police Archives, noted with frustration, "We face a crime of opportunity with no pattern, no common hand, and no visible gain. It is most difficult to proceed where the act leaves no trace but death." The suspects multiply. The investigation widened. Police questioned not only milkmen but also chemists, since arsenic and strychnine could be purchased for pest control. Dozens of small shopkeepers were asked to produce sales records. Most cooperated, but the inquiries revealed how easy it was to acquire deadly substances. Rat poison was cheap, common, and unregulated. Several chemists recalled men purchasing unusual quantities, but descriptions were vague. Tall in a dark coat, a young fellow with glasses, a man with a limp. None could be traced. Theories multiplied. Some detectives believed the poisoner was a disgruntled worker taking revenge on employers. Others suggested a lone misanthrope, slipping poison into bottles left unattended. A few even speculated on women, embittered housewives or servants, though no evidence supported the idea. For Londoners, the mystery grew larger, more sinister. Anyone could be guilty. Anyone could be the poisoner. The role of the press. By now, newspapers were shaping the case as much as the detectives. The Illustrated Police News drew macabre sketches of skeletons carrying milk bottles. The Daily Mirror interviewed grieving families, putting children's faces on the front page. Each new death stoked the panic. Yet the press also pressured Scotland Yard to act. Editorials scolded the police for incompetence, suggesting they had convicted an innocent man. One paper even coined the phrase "the phantom poisoner," a figure imagined to slip through London's dawn, unseen, sprinkling death into bottles. You, as a London reader in 1925, could scarcely escape the imagery. At breakfast, pouring milk into your tea, You might picture that phantom standing at your own gate only hours before. Community reactions. Ordinary people adapted in small, desperate ways. Some families began fetching bottles the instant they were delivered, never leaving them unattended. Others switched to condensed milk, expensive but sealed in tins. Mothers told children never to touch the doorstep bottles, lest poison linger on the foil. Milkmen, once beloved figures, now found themselves watched with suspicion. Some were insulted in the street, others lost customers. Delivery boys, young lads earning pennies, faced scowls as they walked their routes. The bond of trust between Londoners and their milk supply was broken. A breakthrough of sorts. In late 1925, a milkman in Clerkenwell spotted something odd. Arriving early to a house, he saw a man crouched on the stoop, fumbling with bottles. The stranger bolted when challenged, vanishing into alleys, but he left behind a small packet of powder. Testing revealed arsenic. For the first time, there was physical evidence of tampering in progress, but the culprit escaped and no name could be attached to the act. Witness descriptions clashed. Some said the man was middle-aged, others young, some clean-shaven, others with a mustache. Still, the incident confirmed what many suspected. The poisonings were not confined to dairies or milkmen. Someone or several someones were deliberately targeting bottles after delivery. Fear of randomness. Perhaps the most unsettling element was the randomness. Victims came from every class: children, laborers, widows, even a schoolteacher. Some lived in crowded tenements, others in modest middle-class homes. No one seemed chosen. The poisoner struck without logic, without pattern, leaving the city unable to predict who might be next. Unlike burglary, which targeted wealth, or murder, which often sprang from motive, the milk poisoning seemed purposeless, and that made them terrifying. Whispers of motive. Behind closed doors, detectives and journalists alike speculated about motive. Was it personal revenge against dairies, employers, or society itself? Was it extortion, a hidden demand for money unreported in the press? Or was it simply madness, an individual driven by compulsion, who found thrill in the act of invisible murder? One inspector confided to a reporter, "We may never find the man. Such crimes are of a type where the killer can vanish in a crowd, and the evidence burns away in a teacup." The poisonings fade. By 1926, the pace of poisoning slowed. Some attributed this to vigilance. Bottles fetched quickly, milk boiled, chemists pressured to tighten sales. Others believed the culprit had moved on, perhaps even died. A few suggested that the press had exaggerated scattered incidents into a narrative of terror. But families did not forget. For years afterward, older Londoners recalled the time when milk was feared. Children grew up with the memory of mothers sniffing every bottle, pouring with hesitation. The lingering doubt. What remained most troubling was the absence of resolution. Henry Lambert rotted in prison, but few believed he was the true culprit. Scotland Yard never caught another suspect. No confession surfaced, no clear evidence tied any individual to the crimes. And so the case lingered in that uneasy space between memory and myth, part real, part exaggerated, wholly unresolved. The cliffhanger. As London moved toward the turbulence of the 1930s, the milk poisonings faded into the background. But questions remained. Was there truly a phantom poisoner, a lone figure who struck at random? Was Lambert a scapegoat, sacrificed to calm the city? Or were the poisonings not the work of one hand at all, but a collection of scattered incidents, stitched together by panic and press into a single frightening narrative? You are left with the unresolved thought. If the poisonings were real, who was behind them and how could they vanish so completely without answer? By the late 1920s, Londoners were weary of fear. The city had endured war, strikes, and economic strain. The milk bottle seemed a small but sinister reminder of how fragile trust could be. Although the poisoning slowed, the memory of them lingered on every doorstep. Even as other news took the headlines, every London household carried its own private recollections. A neighbor fallen ill, a child's glass of milk thrown out in suspicion, the whispered phrase, "Be careful with the bottles." The story of the milk poisonings never ended with a neat resolution. Instead, it dissolved into silence, leaving behind only questions. Scotland Yard's quiet withdrawal. By 1927, Scotland Yard had little appetite to continue the investigation publicly. Their files, sparse and scattered, show a quiet scaling back of resources. Detectives admitted privately that without witnesses or confessions, there was little chance of solving the case. A closing memo from the Criminal Investigation Department in 1928 put it bluntly. The public believes there is a single poisoner. In truth, there may never have been one. Incidents of contamination, accidents, malice, and misreporting have blurred together. The matter cannot be carried further without new evidence. That bureaucratic phrasing, tidy, detached, was the final word. No new suspects were pursued. Henry Lambert remained in prison, his appeals denied, though doubts about his guilt persisted. The life of Henry Lambert. Lambert's fate became its own story. From his cell, he wrote letters protesting innocence, declaring he had been framed as a convenient scapegoat. His family campaigned quietly for his release, but their petitions fell on deaf ears. For the authorities, admitting error would have meant confessing that the true culprit had never been caught. In later years, some journalists revisited his case, calling it one of the great miscarriages of British justice. Yet by then, Lambert was a forgotten man, aging behind bars. Whether guilty or not, his name was fused with the phrase milk poisoner. Was there ever a single poisoner? Historians looking back have debated whether the milk bottle poisonings were the work of one hand at all. Some argue for a single deranged figure, perhaps emboldened by newspaper attention, who struck sporadically before disappearing. Others suggest a pattern of unrelated incidents, careless storage, deliberate malice in isolated cases, and tragic accidents woven by the press into a narrative of terror. It is possible that multiple individuals, each with private motives, poisoned bottles during those years, their acts mistaken for one another. A dismissed worker in Brixton, a vengeful neighbor in Hackney, a prank gone too far in Stepney. Each act folded into one fearful story. The lack of clarity only deepened the unease. A crime without a face is harder to forget. Social consequences. For ordinary Londoners, the greatest impact was not in courtrooms but in kitchens. The poisonings reshaped the daily ritual of milk delivery. Families became cautious, sometimes distrustful, altering habits that had been unchanged for generations. Households increasingly boiled milk before use, a practice once reserved for infants. Sales of condensed and evaporated milk, tinned and sealed, rose sharply in the mid-1920s. Some dairies began experimenting with sealed foil caps, an innovation that would later become standard. Trust in milkmen, once unshakable, never fully recovered. Though most were blameless, the suspicion lingered. Many found their roots dwindled, their once friendly greetings met with narrowed eyes. The press learns its power. The milk poisonings also revealed the growing influence of the press in shaping crime narratives. In the absence of clear facts, newspapers had filled the void with speculation, illustrations, and sensational headlines. The figure of the phantom poisoner was, in many ways, a creation of the media. And yet, it was a creation that felt real to the public. The idea of a faceless killer lurking at every stoop captured imaginations and fears more powerfully than any courtroom evidence could. In later decades, criminologists would cite the milk poisonings as an early example of how mass media could magnify fear, creating a moral panic around crimes otherwise scattered and small. Lessons for policing. Though Scotland Yard never solved the case, it forced them to confront the challenges of invisible crimes. Poisoning left no fingerprints, no footprints, no broken locks. It was murder by invisibility. In response, detectives began consulting more frequently with chemists and toxicologists, building expertise in identifying and tracing poisons. Forensic science in Britain was still young, but the milk bottle affair underscored its necessity. Later poison cases, from the infamous brides in the bath murders to post-war cyanide poisonings, would rely heavily on those early foundations. Memory and myth. By the 1930s, the milk poisonings had faded into the background of London's collective memory, overshadowed by economic depression and looming war. Yet the story never vanished completely. In quiet recollections, older Londoners warned children about the dangers of trusting appearances. "You never know," they would say, "what might be hiding in the bottle." Writers and journalists occasionally revived the tale, casting it as one of London's forgotten mysteries. Some romanticized the phantom poisoner as a ghostly figure stalking dawn-lit streets. Others used it as a cautionary tale about unchecked access to household staples. Even decades later, the milk bottle carried a faint association with that period of dread, proof of how powerfully fear can attach itself to the ordinary. A reflection for you. When you look back at the milk bottle poisonings, you are not simply looking at scattered crimes. You are looking at a society wrestling with fragility, a city emerging from war, struggling with poverty, mistrust, and the sheer vulnerability of everyday life. The milk was not just a drink, it was a symbol of dependence. Its contamination, whether deliberate or accidental, struck at the heart of that dependence. Fear spread because the crime was not grand but intimate. It crept into kitchens, teacups, and children's breakfasts. The closing thought. And so the story ends not with a solved case but with silence. The bottles continued to appear on stoops, Londoners continued to drink, and the poisoning slipped into history's margins. No confession, no captured culprit, no final certainty. You are left with the thought that perhaps the greatest crimes are not always those of violence and spectacle, but those that transform the ordinary into something terrifying. The milk bottle, once a symbol of nourishment, became for a time a vessel of dread. And in that transformation, it revealed the fragility of trust that holds a community together. Was the phantom poisoner real, or merely the sum of scattered fears stitched into a single ghost? Story 3. The Missing Postman of Illinois, 1889. On the morning of October 15, 1889, in the small town of Pinckneyville, Illinois, the sun rose over quiet streets and fields dotted with frost. The town was like many others in the Midwest at the time: a railroad stop, a cluster of brick storefronts, a few churches, and surrounding farmland. Life was measured by harvests, Sunday sermons, and increasingly by the arrival of the mail. In the late 19th century, the postman was not just a delivery worker. He was a lifeline, a man who carried the world's voices into your hands. Letters from sons out west, notices from government offices, catalogs from Chicago merchants all traveled in the canvas bag slung across his shoulder. Without him, communication faltered. So when Postman John Weir vanished on his route that autumn morning, leaving behind only his empty cart and abandoned mailbag, the town found itself caught in one of the strangest mysteries of the decade. The man himself. John Weir was not an extraordinary figure. He was 42, a father of 3, with a modest house near the railroad tracks. Described by neighbors as punctual and sober, he had carried mail for over a decade. He was the kind of man townspeople barely noticed because he was always there, steady as the ticking of a clock. He knew everyone's habits. He knew which farmers checked their mail first thing in the morning, which households received letters from kin out west, which young women secretly watched for envelopes sealed in unfamiliar handwriting. A postman saw lives in fragments, but Weir kept confidences. People trusted him. The day of the disappearance. On October 15, Weir set out as usual. Witnesses saw him near the depot, exchanging brief greetings. His cart carried letters, parcels, and a small pouch of registered mail, mostly farm payments and business correspondence. By mid-morning, a farmer named Samuel Clark noticed Weir's cart standing empty near a grove outside town. The horse was tethered to a post, calm and unbothered. The mailbag, curiously, was lying on the ground, its contents scattered, but Weir himself was gone. At first, Clark thought the postman had stepped into the woods to relieve himself, but after waiting several minutes, he grew uneasy. The stillness was wrong. He called to neighbors, and soon a small search party combed the grove. No footprints beyond the cart's wheels, no broken branches, no sign of struggle. Weir had simply vanished. The town reacts. News spread quickly through Pinckneyville. By afternoon, dozens of men had joined the search. They scoured fields, barns, and ditches. Bloodhounds were brought in from nearby Du Quoin, but the dogs could not trace a scent beyond the cart. Theories bloomed as quickly as the panic. Some whispered robbery, perhaps bandits had seized him for the registered pouch. Yet the pouch still lay open, its letters untouched. Others suspected foul play by someone he knew, an ambush along his route. A few muttered of darker possibilities. Had Weir abandoned his family? Had he run off under some secret shame? But those who knew him scoffed. John Weir was not a man to run. The federal government steps in. The disappearance of a postman was not merely a local curiosity. In 1889, the United States Post Office was one of the most respected institutions in the country, and mail carriers were considered federal agents. To interfere with them was to strike against the government itself. Within days, postal inspectors arrived from St. Louis. Their presence lent gravity to the case. These inspectors, part detective and part bureaucrat, interviewed townspeople, examined the cart, and cataloged the scattered mail. Their conclusion was unsettling. No robbery, no clear evidence of violence, no sign of voluntary flight. The case was officially classified as missing in performance of duty. The unanswered questions. For you living in Pinckneyville in 1889, the unease would have been constant. The postman's absence was more than one man gone. It was a hole in the town's daily rhythm. Letters piled at the depot. Rumors filled the void where facts should be. Where had he gone? If attacked, why was there no struggle? If he fled, why leave his horse and cart? Why scatter the very mail he had sworn to protect? And most haunting of all, could a man vanish from a sunlit road, in plain sight of farms and fields, without a single witness? Theories spread. Over the next weeks, theories hardened into stories, and stories into legend. Some claimed Weir had been lured into the woods by strangers. Others swore he had been seen boarding a train in St. Louis, though no ticket or record supported it. One tale, repeated in taverns, insisted he had stumbled upon smugglers moving whiskey through the countryside and been silenced. Another whispered that he had carried on a secret correspondence of his own, and when it was discovered, he chose disappearance over scandal. Each theory explained something, but none explained enough. A community in suspense. The case refused to settle. Families locked their doors earlier. Farmers carried rifles on evening walks. The sense that someone could disappear so completely, leaving only an abandoned cart, gnawed at the town. And for months afterward, whenever footsteps echoed too close behind you on a dark road, or when a stranger appeared at the depot, you might feel the chill of John Weir's absence. The cliffhanger. By winter, the searches had ceased and the inspectors had left, their reports inconclusive. Weir's family struggled on, his wife insisting he would never have left willingly. The mail routes were reassigned, the horse sold, the cart reused. Life outwardly resumed. But in the quiet hours, Pinckneyville carried the question like a wound. What became of the postman who vanished into daylight? The disappearance of John Weir became more than just a local mystery. It turned into a test of how much uncertainty a small town could bear. Pinckneyville, a place where people prided themselves on knowing their neighbors, now faced the disturbing fact that one of their most visible men, a postman on open roads, had seemingly evaporated. The inspectors return. By December 1889, the Post Office Department sent a second team of inspectors. Their arrival signaled Washington's concern, not only for the missing man but for the reputation of the Postal Service. To lose mail was bad enough. To lose the man entrusted with it was unthinkable. The inspectors retraced every step of Weir's route. They spoke again to Samuel Clark, the farmer who first found the cart. Clark repeated the details. The horse was calm, tied as if by Weir himself, and the mailbag lay half spilled on the dirt. No sign of struggle, no cries heard. The inspectors took statements from dozens of townspeople. Some swore they had seen Weir walking the road near the grove only minutes before his cart was found. Others claimed to have noticed strangers lingering near the depot days earlier. But when pressed for descriptions, details blurred: tall, short, dark coat, light hat. Memory shifted with the telling. The absence of motive. Investigators looked for motive. Had Weir enemies, debts, hidden troubles? His finances showed nothing unusual. His family insisted he was content, not a man to abandon home. His colleagues at the post office vouched for his honesty. One rumor suggested he had carried a package of payroll cash for a local mine that day, and that robbers had taken him for it. But the inspectors found no record of such a shipment. If robbers had struck, why leave the mail? Why not flee with the horse and cart? It was the absence of motive that most confounded them. Crimes left traces, but this left none. The theories multiply. By early 1890, theories had hardened into competing camps. The runaway theory. Some argued Weir had left by choice, perhaps boarding a train under a false name. They whispered of debts to gamblers in St. Louis or of an affair exposed. Yet there was no proof. He left behind money, possessions, even personal letters. The murder theory. Others believed he had been killed, his body hidden in wells, caves, or coal shafts common to the region. Searchers dragged ponds and checked abandoned barns but found nothing. Without a body, murder remained speculation. The abduction theory. A more dramatic camp insisted he had stumbled on a secret smugglers, counterfeiters, or even traveling criminals passing through and been carried off. The notion spread easily, for southern Illinois was then a crossroads of illicit trade. Each theory explained part of the mystery, yet each left stubborn gaps. The rumors of the woods. As winter dragged on, stories took on a darker hue. Some swore that at night, strange lights flickered in the grove where Weir vanished. Others claimed hunters had heard cries echoing in the distance. A group of boys told of finding scraps of cloth snagged on branches, though when searched, nothing appeared. Folklore began to attach itself to the case, as folklore always does in the absence of answers. The grove became a place children avoided, a place mothers mentioned in warnings. "Stay clear of there," they would say. That's where the postman went. The family's struggle. Meanwhile, Weir's wife, Margaret, faced the grim reality of life without her husband's wages. The post office offered a small stipend but no pension, since no death had been proven. Neighbors organized church collections. Newspapers printed sympathetic sketches of Margaret at her hearth, 3 children clinging to her skirts. But sympathy could not answer her question. Every day she kept hopping for word: a body found, a letter received, anything. None came. A new lead or a false one. In March 1890, excitement flared when a man in Carbondale, 50 miles away, claimed to have seen someone matching Weir's description boarding a freight train west. The report reached the inspectors, who hurried to follow. But witnesses contradicted one another, and the lead evaporated. Later that year, a skull was found in a field outside Murfreesboro. Rumors spread instantly that it was Weir's, but doctors determined it belonged to a much younger man. The town's hopes for closure were dashed. The silence of the male. Perhaps the most haunting detail was that none of Weir's own mail ever surfaced. Inspectors watched closely for letters bearing his handwriting or signature. They examined postmarks across states, hoping he had written under another name, but the silence was absolute. It was as if John Weir had not only vanished, but had erased his own voice from the world. The psychological weight. For the people of Pinckneyville, the unresolved case carried a peculiar weight. In towns where crimes were usually personal and visible, a fight, a theft, a barn burned, the postman's disappearance represented something new, a void, an absence with no explanation. Imagine yourself in that place and time. You see the horse tied neatly, the scattered mail on the ground. You walk into the grove expecting to find a man, and instead you find only silence. That silence spreads into every conversation, every walk along the road, every letter handed from postman to hand. The disappearance became less about Weir himself, and more about the town's confrontation with mystery. The inspector's frustration. By the summer of 1890, the federal inspectors reluctantly filed their final reports. One wrote, "It is our conclusion that Mr. Weir either departed of his own accord or met with foul play by parties unknown. In either event, absent evidence, the matter must rest." It was bureaucratic language, but behind it lay frustration. The post office prided itself on order and reliability. To lose a man without trace was not only tragic but humiliating. The case was closed in Washington. In Pinckneyville, it never was. The cliffhanger. Years passed, but the story of John Weir lingered like unfinished business. His family lived in limbo. Townspeople spoke his name in lowered tones. Each time a body was found along the river or a skeleton uncovered in a field, speculation surged anew. And always the same question circled back, unanswered. Did John Weir choose to vanish, or was he taken, and if taken, by whom and why? By 1891, the official investigation into John Weir's disappearance had wound down, but the story did not fade. Pinckneyville carried it forward, told and retold at kitchen tables, in church basements, and in the smoky backrooms of taverns. Every retelling added detail, suspicion, or speculation, until the missing postman became both a man and a legend, a figure of absence woven into the town's identity. The long silence. The post office closed its files and Washington moved on, but Margaret Weir and her children lived with the silence every day. Without a death certificate, she was denied a widow's pension. She petitioned repeatedly, gathering affidavits from neighbors attesting to John's good character, arguing he would never have abandoned his family. Still, officials replied with the same phrase, insufficient evidence of death. Her household fell into hardship. Neighbors contributed wood and food in winter, but charity could not replace stability. Each knock at the door carried a moment of hope, perhaps word had come at last. None ever did. Theories that refused to die. Over the 1890s, new theories continued to surface. The coal shaft theory. Some miners believed Weir's body lay at the bottom of an abandoned shaft, hidden where no searchers dared descend. When shafts collapsed, they said, he was buried forever. The railroad theory. Travelers insisted they had seen him in St. Louis, Kansas City, even Denver, living under another name. These sightings were vague, unconfirmed, but persistent. The crime witness theory. A few argued he had stumbled upon something, a gang moving whiskey, counterfeiters printing notes, or a murder in progress and been silenced. In a region crisscrossed by illicit trade, the idea held weight. Each theory explained enough to sustain itself, but none explained everything. The inspector's regret. Years later, a retired postal inspector admitted in an interview with the St. Louis Globe-Democrat that Weir's case was the one that haunted him. "We found no trace, not a footprint, not a witness we could trust. It was as though he walked into air." That phrase, "walked into air," entered local memory. It captured the eerie quality of the case, better than any official report could. Community memory. For the townspeople, the disappearance became a story they carried with them. Parents told children to stay close to home, invoking the postman as a warning. Ministers used his vanishing in sermons about the suddenness of death. Farmers mentioned it when locking their barns at night. Remember what happened to the postman. It shaped how people thought of safety in their small town. If John Weir could vanish without a trace, then perhaps no one was truly safe. The family's fate. Margaret Weir raised her children alone, never remarrying. When she died in 1912, her obituary still described her as the widow of John Weir, the postman who disappeared. Her children carried the legacy too, asked about it throughout their lives. What do you think happened to your father? None had answers. The family's grief was compounded by ambiguity. Death closes a door. Disappearance leaves it ajar forever. The larger context. Weir's disappearance was not entirely unique. The late 19th century was full of transient lives, drifters, railroad men, migrants who vanished between towns. But Weir was different. He was rooted, known, trusted, a fixture of daily life. His vanishing was therefore more unsettling. It was not the disappearance of a stranger, but of the man who brought you your letters. And in an era when the federal government was still solidifying its authority in rural America, the case carried symbolic weight. If even the U.S. mail could be interrupted by mystery, what else was vulnerable? The lessons learned. The case spurred quiet reforms. Postal inspectors, embarrassed by the lack of resolution, pressed for stronger protections for mail carriers. Routes were adjusted to minimize isolated stretches. Carriers were encouraged to work in pairs when possible, though budgets often prevented it. The message was clear. The safety of the postman was a matter of national trust. Later in the early 20th century, when rural free delivery expanded, inspectors cited Weir's case as a reason for better training and stronger oversight. Though rarely mentioned by name, the ghost of his disappearance influenced policy. The myth takes shape. By the 1920s, the case had slipped into folklore. In Perry County, children told each other stories of the haunted grove where the postman vanished. Travelers passing through Pinckneyville sometimes heard locals point out the place as if it were a landmark. That's where the postman disappeared, and no one ever saw him again. The facts blurred. Some said blood was found near the cart it was. Others claimed his hat was nailed to a tree, pure invention. In the absence of answers, myth filled the void. Reflection. What does it mean, you might wonder, for a man to vanish so completely? It meant for Pinckneyville that certainty could not be taken for granted. It meant that even in daylight, on familiar roads, the world held mysteries too great for explanation. And it meant that trust, the quiet trust of letters delivered, and duties fulfilled, could shatter without warning. For you as a listener, it is easy to focus on the crime, the theories, the vanished body. But beneath all of it was a family, a wife, children, and a community who lived not with answers, but with silence. Closing thought. The mail was reassigned, the routes carried on, and the town endured. But the story of John Weir lingered, unresolved, until it became less about one man and more about the fragility of order in a world where certainty was never guaranteed. And so you are left with the thought: was the missing postman the victim of crime, of choice, or of accident, or was he simply swallowed by history's silence, another letter never delivered? Story 4. The Laundry Token Forgers of San Francisco's Chinatown. In the last decades of the 19th century, San Francisco's Chinatown was a city within a city. Its narrow streets bustled with markets, apothecaries, gambling parlors, and, above all, laundries. For thousands of Chinese immigrants, barred from many trades by discrimination and exclusionary laws, laundry work offered one of the few paths to survival. Nearly every block had its shop windows steamed, shirts hanging to dry, irons clattering late into the night. And with the laundries came a system that, though small and practical, would give rise to one of the strangest crime waves in Chinatown: the counterfeiting of laundry tokens. The birth of the token system. The business of laundry required organization. A single shop might serve dozens of customers a week, their clothes bundled, boiled, pressed, and stored until pickup. But paper receipts, easily lost or destroyed, proved impractical. Out of necessity, laundries began issuing small brass, copper, or even cardboard tokens. Each was stamped with the shop's name or initials. Customers handed over laundry, received a token, and redeemed it when they returned. The tokens were simple, but they carried value, a kind of currency specific to the laundry trade. If you held the token, you could claim the clothing. Trust in the tokens was trust in the laundry itself. A quiet but valuable commodity. By the 1880s, tokens circulated widely across San Francisco. In working-class neighborhoods, it was common to find men with a pocketful of brass discs, each tied to a different shop. In effect, they became small units of exchange, proof of a deposit, sometimes even traded between customers. Wherever value concentrates, crime follows. It did not take long before the first forgeries appeared. The first rumors. The earliest complaints came around 1887. A Chinese laundryman named Wang Li reported that customers had redeemed shirts with tokens he did not recognize, though they bore his name. At first, he suspected forgetfulness, perhaps he had issued them years earlier and forgotten. But as more suspicious tokens appeared, he realized they were freshly made, imitations of his own. Word spread quickly among the laundries. Others, too, discovered counterfeit discs slipping into circulation. The tokens were crude copies, but convincing enough to pass in the quick exchange of a crowded shop. Each forgery meant real loss, a bundle of clothes taken without payment. The difficulty of policing. The police were slow to act. To them, forged laundry tokens seemed trivial compared to burglaries or violent crime. But for the laundrymen, the losses were real. A single false token might represent several dollars' worth of labor and materials at a time when profit margins were razor thin. Moreover, laundries were already under scrutiny. San Francisco's government had passed restrictive ordinances targeting Chinese workers, even attempting to ban laundries in wooden buildings, a transparent attempt to drive them out. In 1886, the famous Yick Wo v. Hopkins Supreme Court decision struck down the ordinance as discriminatory, but hostility remained. Against that backdrop, the laundries could not rely on authorities. Many were left to defend themselves. Forgery as an organized trade. It soon became clear that these were not isolated counterfeits, but part of a larger operation. Inspectors discovered that brass discs were being stamped in backroom workshops, often by men with knowledge of metalworking. A single die could produce hundreds of tokens, sold cheaply to petty criminals who used them to buy clothing from unsuspecting laundries. Some investigators even suspected connections to larger counterfeiting rings that also produced fake coins. The same presses and dies could be turned from nickels to laundry tokens with little adjustment. To outsiders, the crime seemed absurdly small-scale. To those within Chinatown, it was devastating. The distrust it bred. For ordinary customers, the scandal caused frustration. Honest men found themselves accused of fraud when they presented legitimate tokens, simply because suspicion had grown so high. Laundrymen scrutinized every disc, sometimes refusing them outright. This breakdown of trust eroded the very system the tokens had been designed to protect. Without faith in the tokens, how could the business function? The case of the vanished laundry. One story recorded in the San Francisco Call illustrates the chaos. In 1889, a customer named James O'Donnell presented a token at a shop on Stockton Street, claiming several shirts and a jacket. The proprietor, suspicious, compared the token to his stock and declared it false. An argument followed. O'Donnell swore he had received it legitimately, but the laundryman refused. The next morning, O'Donnell returned with police, only to discover that the laundry itself had closed overnight. The proprietor had vanished, taking all clothing with him. Whether he fled because of the counterfeit trade or because he was complicit in it was never known. Dozens of customers lost their garments entirely. A crime hidden in plain sight. By the early 1890s, counterfeit laundry tokens were so widespread that newspapers began referring to them as a silent plague in Chinatown. Unlike spectacular robberies or murders, this crime left no bodies, no alarms. It operated in the quiet passing of small discs, hidden in plain sight. The broader public largely ignored it, dismissing it as a problem confined to the Chinese quarter. But for those who relied on laundry work to survive, it was a daily threat, one that could mean the difference between solvency and ruin. A tangle of questions. So you are left with the opening mysteries of the case. Who were the forgers, and how large was their network? Were the counterfeiters outsiders exploiting Chinatown, or insiders preying on their own? And how could a community already burdened by discrimination defend itself against a crime so quiet, so easy to dismiss? The answers would come slowly, through police raids, community resistance, and court cases that revealed just how far the forgeries had spread. But in 1889, the story was only beginning, and the laundries of San Francisco faced a battle not just for profit, but for trust itself. By 1891, the whispers of counterfeit laundry tokens had grown into open frustration. What had begun as an occasional nuisance was now a steady bleed on San Francisco's Chinatown. Shopkeepers complained that false tokens appeared daily. Some laundries lost so much clothing to fraud that they closed entirely, their windows darkened and their signs removed. It was no longer a curiosity, it was an industry of forgery. The anatomy of a fake. To understand the scope of the problem, you must picture a laundry token. Most were small, circular, about the size of a dime or nickel, stamped with crude lettering. Sing Lee Laundry, 841 Stockton, or simply initials in Chinese characters. Some included holes so they could be strung on twine. A real token was stamped in brass or copper, sturdy enough to survive months in a pocket. Forgers copied them using the same methods as counterfeit coiners. With a die and a press, they could churn out hundreds in a week. The tokens were rarely perfect, letters uneven, edges rough, but in the rush of business, laundrymen often failed to notice. Detectives later recovered boxes of blank brass discs from a workshop on DuPont Street. The tools were the same as those used by small-time counterfeiters of nickels. The overlap between coin forgers and token forgers was obvious. The skills were transferable, and the risk lower, since police did not initially treat token forgery with the gravity of counterfeiting U.S. currency. Following the tokens. It was community pressure, not police initiative, that forced the matter into courtrooms. In 1892, a group of laundrymen petitioned the city for help, arguing that their livelihood was under attack. Though city officials often dismissed Chinatown concerns, the petition drew attention in the San Francisco Examiner, which published a story under the headline, "The Sham Tokens of DuPont Street." Police began raids, targeting metalworkers suspected of aiding counterfeiters. In one case, officers arrested a tinsmith named Charles Gray, accused of stamping false tokens for several laundries. Gray claimed ignorance, saying he thought he was producing legitimate replacements, but testimony suggested otherwise. He had been paid under the table in cash by men who never used the laundries themselves. This case revealed a crucial detail. The forgery network was not confined to Chinatown. Outsiders, white craftsmen, metalworkers, even former coin counterfeiters participated, supplying tools and materials to those who distributed the tokens. Inside the distribution. How did counterfeit tokens reach the laundries? Testimonies suggest several methods. Street peddlers. Tokens were sold in alleys by peddlers who also trafficked in dice, opium, or cheap jewelry. For a small sum, a man could buy enough fake tokens to redeem several shirts worth of clothing. Petty criminals. Thieves targeted laundries not by breaking in, but by walking in with brass discs. Some redeemed the clothing for personal use, others resold it at pawn shops or second-hand stores. Dishonest customers. A few regular customers, realizing the value of counterfeit tokens, used them repeatedly, hopping to pass undetected amid honest transactions. The flow was steady enough that some laundries reported losing dozens of garments each month. The community's response. Faced with both crime and discrimination, laundrymen began defending themselves. Some shops abandoned tokens altogether, switching back to paper receipts despite the risks of loss. Others devised elaborate marks stamping tokens with hand-carved symbols, drilling distinctive holes, or using softer metals that forgers found difficult to mimic. But none of these defenses was foolproof. Counterfeiters adapted quickly, creating dyes that mimicked even the unique symbols. The forgery network had grown too skilled. In meetings at family associations and benevolent societies, laundrymen discussed pooling resources to hire private guards or investigators. Some proposed appealing directly to federal authorities, framing the tokens as a form of interstate commerce to attract attention. But Chinatown voices were often ignored outside their community. The police perspective. Police records from the early 1890s reveal a mixture of irritation and dismissal. One officer wrote, "The Chinese complain of brass discs. They lose shirts. We have larger matters." To the police, laundry tokens did not carry the weight of banknotes or coinage. Yet when pressed, they admitted the scale was troubling. If forgers could move hundreds of tokens without consequence, what stopped them from returning to counterfeit money? Slowly, the department began to treat token forgery as training ground for larger crimes. The chief of police, in a report to the Board of Supervisors, warned, "A city that tolerates sham tokens will find sham coins in circulation before long." The high-profile raid. In 1894, pressure culminated in a high-profile raid on a workshop near Pacific Avenue. Acting on a tip, police burst into a backroom where two men, one Chinese, one Irish-American, operated a small press. Boxes of blanks, dies, and finished tokens lay stacked against the wall. The raid was reported widely, with lurid headlines about a token factory in Chinatown. The arrests confirmed what many had suspected. The trade was interracial, with Chinese laundrymen sometimes complicit, and white craftsmen providing tools and expertise. The city, however, presented the raid as proof of Chinatown's corruption, feeding prejudice rather than alleviating it. The men were convicted of forgery and sentenced to short prison terms. But the problem did not vanish. The economic toll. By the mid-1890s, some laundries had lost so much business that they closed. Families left the city, their livelihoods ruined by what seemed a petty crime but was, in fact, systemic theft. Others survived only by tightening operations, refusing to serve customers they did not know, or requiring advance payment. These measures strained relationships. Honest customers resented suspicion, while laundrymen felt trapped between trust and survival. The humble brass token, once a symbol of efficiency, had become an emblem of uncertainty. The ongoing mystery. Even with arrests, the scale of the forgery suggested a larger network remained. Who had profited most from the counterfeit trade? Were there hidden workshops still stamping brass discs? And why did the police never pursue the question fully, settling instead for symbolic raids? The deeper truth may have been that laundry token forgery was not simply a crime of greed, but also one of opportunity born of discrimination, sustained by neglect, and magnified by the vulnerability of a community left to fend for itself. The cliffhanger. By the end of the decade, counterfeit tokens still circulated, though less openly. The community had adapted, but the scars remained. And you are left with the pressing question: was the forgery trade truly dismantled, or did it simply retreat into deeper shadows, waiting for its chance to resurface? By the close of the 19th century, San Francisco's laundry token crisis was less visible but far from resolved. To casual observers, it seemed the police raids and scattered convictions had put an end to the counterfeit trade. Newspapers turned their attention to other spectacles: railroad strikes, corruption scandals, or sensational murders. But if you walked down DuPont Street or lingered in a laundry after dusk, you could still hear the quiet worries. The brass discs were out there. They had not disappeared. The trials that fell short. Court records from 1894 to 1896 reveal a handful of prosecutions. Defendants were usually caught with small caches of counterfeit tokens or the tools to make them. The charges were filed under forgery or fraudulent representation of property, but sentences were often light fines, brief jail terms, sometimes probation. Jurors and judges did not grasp the damage. To them, these were not banknotes or gold coins but cheap slivers of brass. A token might represent a shirt or pair of trousers, worth only a few cents. How could such a thing warrant serious punishment? This mismatch between legal perception and economic reality left Chinatown frustrated. A single customer using counterfeit tokens might rob a shop of weeks' income, yet the courts treated it as a petty nuisance. The survivors of the trade. Interviews conducted decades later in the 1930s captured the voices of old laundrymen who remembered the era of counterfeit tokens. One, identified only as Mr. Wang, described how his father's shop had closed in 1895. They came with the brass discs: many men, many weeks. We give out shirts, trousers, coats, and never get paid. My father sold the iron stove to pay rent, then no more laundry. Another recalled becoming suspicious of every token handed across the counter. We tested them with teeth, with fire. Still the false ones slipped through. We trusted no one. These testimonies paint a picture of an economic parasite that hollowed out businesses already strained by prejudice and poverty. Shifts in strategy. By the late 1890s, many laundries abandoned tokens altogether. They reverted to handwritten paper slips or developed new systems, numbering garments with ink, sewing tiny colored threads into collars, or stamping names directly onto fabric. Some innovations proved more reliable than brass discs. Others introduced new challenges: lost slips, smudged ink, disputes with customers. Yet laundries endured because they had to. In a city that excluded Chinese men from many trades, washing clothes remained one of the few avenues open. And so, the counterfeit token trade may have died less because police crushed it, and more because laundries adapted away from tokens, rendering forgery unprofitable. What the records suggest. Historical fragments hint at lingering operations. A 1901 police blotter noted counterfeit brass tickets, Chinese laundry among seized items during a raid on a metal shop. Another report from 1903 described a cache of brass coins with no currency mark, implying the practice persisted into the new century. But by then, the scale was diminished. Token forgery had peaked in the 1880s and 1890s when the system was widespread. As laundries evolved, the opportunity closed. Beyond the tokens, a social mirror. If you step back, the story of the laundry tokens is less about brass discs than about the vulnerability of an isolated community. Chinese laundrymen were targeted precisely because they had little recourse. Their businesses depended on trust in a hostile city. When that trust was undermined, they had no allies in law enforcement, no advocates in government. The counterfeiters exploited this gap, and not only Chinese criminals, but also white craftsmen and petty thieves who knew Chinatown complaints rarely carried weight in court. The crime flourished in the shadow of discrimination. In this sense, the tokens became a mirror. They reflected how a society's neglect of justice for one group created fertile ground for crime. The brass discs told a story not only of fraud but of exclusion. Legacy in the law. Though forgotten by most, the laundry token cases influenced how San Francisco approached minor counterfeiting. By the 1910s, city ordinances explicitly criminalized the forgery of receipts, checks, or tokens representing property. The language was broad, no longer distinguishing between money and the humbler symbols of exchange. Historians argue this change stemmed in part from the Chinatown disputes. The recognition came late, but it established the idea that trust-based tokens, even for something as small as laundry, deserved legal protection. Fading into memory. By the 1920s, laundry tokens themselves had become relics. Paper slips, stamps, and later mechanical numbering systems replaced them. Tourists bought old brass tokens as curios, unaware of the hardship they once represented. Antique shops sold them in bundles, labeled Chinese laundry coins, stripped of context. But in the memories of those who lived through it, the counterfeit tokens were no quaint novelty. They were scars, reminders of stolen clothing, lost shops, and the constant fear of being cheated. Reflection. So what does it mean, this story of brass discs and small thefts? On its face, it seems trivial, tokens exchanged for shirts and trousers. Yet the scale of forgery shows how even the smallest instruments of trust can be corrupted, and how crime thrives where justice is unevenly applied. For you listening now, the lesson is not about tokens, but about the fragility of systems built on neglect. When communities are left to defend themselves, when authorities dismiss their losses, crime becomes not only possible but inevitable. The brass shadows of Chinatown remind us that crime is not always dramatic. Sometimes it hides in ordinary objects, in tokens passed from hand to hand, in the quiet erosion of livelihoods, and its impact lingers long after the last counterfeit disc is stamped. Story 5. The Railroad Watch Swindle of Pennsylvania. In the late 19th century, America moved on iron rails. Trains carried not only passengers and freight, but also the rhythm of national life itself. Before highways and airplanes, the railroad was how towns lived or died, how farmers sent their crops, how mail crossed from coast to coast. And at the very heart of this system, hidden not in steam engines or steel tracks, but in pockets and waistcoats, was the railroad watch. The essential instrument. For the railroad worker, especially the conductor and the engineer, precision was everything. Two trains on a single line needed to know exactly where and when they would pass. A difference of 2 minutes could mean nothing in daily life, but on a busy track it could mean disaster, a head-on collision. Because of this, the railroad watch was more than jewelry. It was a tool of survival, an unofficial badge of professionalism. These watches had to meet exacting standards, accurate to within 30 seconds per week, resistant to shocks, temperature, and dust. The best were made by American manufacturers like Waltham, Elgin, and later Hamilton. Workers saved for months to buy one. Owning a reliable watch meant not only steady employment, but also respect among peers. Pennsylvania, a web of rails. Nowhere was the culture of timekeeping stronger than in Pennsylvania. By the 1880s, it was the beating heart of the American railroad system. Lines crisscrossed the state, connecting Pittsburgh's steel mills, Philadelphia's docks, coal mines in Scranton, and the countless small towns in between. Railroad men formed a fraternity of sorts. They gathered in depots, swapped stories in saloons, and compared watches as naturally as others compared tools or horses. To misplace or damage one's watch was a humiliation. To lack one entirely meant exclusion from the trade. This atmosphere created fertile ground for both commerce and crime. The first shadows. By 1887, Newspaper classifieds in Pittsburgh and Harrisburg began advertising railroad watches at unbeatable prices. Small print revealed they were not Waltham or Elgin, but lesser brands, sometimes imported cheaply from Switzerland or even crudely assembled in backroom shops. The trick was simple. Salesmen traveled along the rail lines, introducing themselves as official agents of a railroad or watchmaker. They displayed heavy, gleaming watches that seemed indistinguishable from the real thing. Prices were a fraction of the usual $12 instead of $40. For men struggling to make ends meet, the offer was irresistible. Some handed over savings. Others pawned possessions to afford the bargain. Only later, often weeks or months later, did the swindle reveal itself. The defective timepieces. The cheap watches kept poor time. Some lost minutes each day, others stopped altogether when jostled. A few had faces designed to mimic Waltham's distinct engravings, but the insides were flimsy brass gears prone to snapping. Railroaders discovered the truth at the worst possible moments. A brakeman in Altoona missed a train connection because his watch had slowed. An engineer in Johnstown nearly collided with an oncoming train after trusting a faulty timepiece. Stories like these spread through Pennsylvania's depots like wildfire. The shame was doubled. The victims had not only wasted money but endangered lives. Investigative whispers. By 1890, railroad companies themselves took notice. Inspectors began requiring workers to submit watches for testing before duty. Men caught with substandard watches were suspended. For some, it meant losing jobs entirely. Pressure grew on police to investigate. Yet at first, law enforcement hesitated. The swindle did not fit neatly into existing categories of crime. Were these counterfeit watches? Not exactly. They were genuine but misleadingly sold. Was it fraud? Perhaps, but the merchants often disappeared before charges could be filed. What authorities knew was this. A network of traveling salesmen, many working in pairs, moved along Pennsylvania's rail lines, exploiting trust. Their wagons and satchels carried crates of cheap watches. They sold quickly, collected cash, and vanished to the next town. A broader economy of deception. The railroad watch swindle was not isolated. It belonged to a larger wave of fraud in post-Civil War America, when booming industries created demand for specialized goods and swindlers rushed to fill it. There were counterfeit mining tools in West Virginia, fake patent medicines in Ohio, and watered-down lubricants sold to factories in Pittsburgh. But none carried the symbolic weight of the railroad watch, because in that small pocket timepiece lay not only personal pride but public safety. This gave the swindle a darker edge. It was not merely theft, it threatened lives by undermining the very system designed to keep trains from colliding. A case in Harrisburg. The first detailed record of the swindle comes from Harrisburg in 1891. A conductor named James Harkins testified that he had purchased a railroad official standard watch from two traveling men who claimed to represent the Pennsylvania Railroad itself. They even produced forged papers bearing the company's logo. Harkins trusted them and paid $15. The watch stopped within a week. When he attempted to confront the sellers, they had already vanished, leaving no trace but a rented room in a boarding house. Harkins brought the matter to local police, who at first dismissed it as a poor bargain. Only when the railroad itself pressured authorities did the investigation begin. The railroad steps in. Recognizing the threat, several Pennsylvania lines introduced stricter inspection systems. They contracted independent watch inspectors, jewelers authorized to test and certify watches for railroad use. Each worker had to present his watch at regular intervals. This system eventually became standardized across the nation. But in Pennsylvania during the early 1890s, it was still forming. That gap gave the swindlers room to maneuver, offering false certificates and convincing men their watches were acceptable. The game of deception became more elaborate. Fake seals, forged signatures, even counterfeit watch chains marked with PRR, Pennsylvania Railroad surfaced. The swindle was evolving from shoddy goods to outright forgery. Growing public alarm. Newspapers began to warn against the scams. The Pittsburgh Dispatch ran a story titled "False Timepieces Imperil Lives" in 1892, warning railroad workers to avoid itinerant salesmen. The Philadelphia Inquirer described bogus inspectors who preyed on unsuspecting men in small towns. But these warnings did little. The salesmen operated in the gray edges of law enforcement. They were gone before articles circulated, and by the time police pursued leads, they had moved 3 towns down the line. The swindle spread not only across Pennsylvania, but into Ohio, Maryland, and New Jersey. What began as a regional nuisance threatened to become a national hazard. Unresolved tension. By the mid-1890s, tension mounted. Railroad officials demanded stronger laws. Workers whispered of colleagues ruined by faulty watches. Police began piecing together clues about a central distributor, perhaps even a manufacturing hub supplying the swindlers. But the network remained elusive. Were the salesmen organized, or were they independent operators copying each other's tricks? Who supplied the watches, and how far did the chain of fraud extend? These questions lingered as investigators deepened their search questions that would soon lead them into surprising directions. By the mid-1890s, railroad inspectors in Pennsylvania were struggling with more than just the accuracy of timepieces. They were battling a wave of deception that tested both the patience of workers and the authority of the railroads themselves. What had begun as an annoyance was now seen as a genuine threat to public safety. Early investigations. The Harrisburg case involving James Harkins had set a precedent. His testimony, combined with railroad pressure, led to the first coordinated investigation into the watch swindle. Local detectives, often unaccustomed to white-collar crime, now had to learn how to follow trails of forged papers, deceptive advertisements, and vanishing salesmen. One detective, Henry Whitman of the Harrisburg Police, became particularly dedicated to the case. A veteran of more traditional policing break-ins, saloon fights, petty theft, Whitman quickly realized that these swindlers operated differently. They rarely stayed in one place. They traveled in pairs or small groups, and they left behind almost nothing tangible beyond worthless watches. Whitman's early reports reveal frustration. "No sooner do we receive a name," he wrote in 1892, "than it vanishes with the wind. These fellows know the timetables better than we do, and they ride the rails with ease. Each stop is a fresh pasture." Patterns begin to emerge. Despite the challenges, investigators notice patterns. Boarding houses. Salesmen almost always rented modest rooms near depots, often paying a week's rate but leaving after 3 nights. Pawn shops. When business was slow, swindlers pawned unsold watches to keep moving. This left a paper trail, receipts signed with false names, but sometimes with enough consistency to suggest repeat aliases. Forgery. The same forged Pennsylvania Railroad seals appeared across different towns, suggesting a central producer rather than independent fraudsters. These hints pointed to organization. The swindle was not random opportunism, it had infrastructure behind it. A trail to Pittsburgh. By late 1893, a breakthrough came from Pittsburgh. A jeweler who also served as a railroad watch inspector noticed that multiple men had presented watches stamped with the same forged certification. Curious, he kept one of the suspects talking long enough for police to arrive. The man was identified as Charles Benson, a 32-year-old drifter with prior arrests for petty theft. Interrogation revealed that Benson was not the mastermind but a hired salesman. He admitted to receiving shipments of cheap watches from a warehouse in Pittsburgh's Strip District, a neighborhood already known for its mix of legitimate commerce and shady dealings. The warehouse, however, was empty by the time police arrived. Whoever managed the operation had cleared out quickly. Still, Benson's confession gave investigators their first concrete link. The swindle was being supplied from an urban hub, not improvised by traveling conmen. Newspapers fanned the fire. Meanwhile, newspapers across Pennsylvania amplified the story. They painted the swindle not only as a fraud, but as a looming danger to the traveling public. Editorials declared that a man who tampers with railroad time tampers with lives. This public framing put pressure on lawmakers. Bills were proposed to regulate traveling salesmen, require licenses for watch inspectors, and impose harsher penalties for fraudulent certification. Railroads, eager to protect both safety and reputation, lobbied aggressively for these reforms. But legislation moved slowly, and the swindlers remained quick. For every salesman arrested, another two appeared, riding new lines, carrying new crates of gleaming but useless timepieces. The watch inspectors tightened control. One of the most effective countermeasures came not from police, but from the system of railroad watch inspectors. These independent jewelers, hired by railroad companies, became gatekeepers. They demanded that each worker submit his watch for periodic checks, sometimes monthly. The process was strict. A jeweler examined the watch's mechanism, recorded its performance, and stamped approval in a worker's timebook. Without this approval, a conductor or engineer could not work. This reduced the danger on the rails, but it also heightened the humiliation for men duped by swindlers. A worker who failed inspection not only lost money but faced suspension. That bitterness fueled the hunt for those responsible. From Pittsburgh to Chicago. By 1895, investigators widened their scope. Evidence suggested that the swindle stretched beyond Pennsylvania. Crates of cheap watches were traced to Chicago, a city teeming with wholesalers, jewelers, and opportunists. In Chicago, investigators found that a handful of import firms specialized in bringing in low-grade Swiss movements unfinished watch mechanisms and assembling them cheaply with American-style faces. These firms often skirted legal boundaries but rarely crossed them outright. They argued that they were selling legitimate products, even if the quality was poor. The real crime lay in how those watches were marketed, as official railroad standard timepieces. Detectives now faced the slippery line between lawful commerce and outright fraud. The sales network. Through interviews, police pieced together how the network functioned. Suppliers shipped cheap watches from Chicago or Pittsburgh. Middlemen stored them in small warehouses near depots. Salesmen traveled in pairs, moving along rail lines, selling quickly and disappearing. Forgery certificates, seals, and chains were often produced by local printers or engravers willing to look the other way. This division of labor made prosecution difficult. Arrest a salesman and he named a middleman. Catch a middleman and he swore ignorance of the forgery. The suppliers, shielded by distance and vague contracts, claimed plausible deniability. A human cost. Behind the mechanics of the swindle lay human stories. One brakeman, Thomas Riley of Altoona, nearly lost his job after presenting a failed watch to his inspector. Humiliated, he confessed he had bought it from a traveling salesman after pawning his father's old gold chain. "I thought it was the start of my career," Riley told investigators, "but it near ended it before it began." In another case, an engineer in Reading narrowly avoided a collision when his watch ran 3 minutes slow. His testimony in a company hearing described the moment with a trembling voice. "I looked at the face, and it lied to me. It told me I had more time than I did." Such accounts gave the swindle its emotional weight. This was not just about stolen money, it was about dignity, safety, and the fragile trust that kept the railroad system running. An arrest in Altoona. In 1896, Altoona police arrested two men carrying satchels of counterfeit watches. Their names were John and William Harper, brothers who admitted under questioning that they had worked for different suppliers over the years. The Harpers revealed a telling detail. Each time a supplier was threatened by investigation, he shifted operations to a new city, using fresh aliases. The network was not centralized under one mastermind but fluid, with opportunists filling the void whenever another was caught. This explained the resilience of the swindle. It was less an organization than an ecosystem of fraud, feeding on the constant demand for affordable watches among railroad men. The railroad's public campaign. Frustrated, railroad companies launched a campaign of education. Circulars were distributed to workers warning them never to buy watches from traveling agents. Posters in depots carried blunt messages. Trust only certified inspectors, your life depends on it. This campaign had mixed results. Some men heeded the warnings, but others, driven by financial hardship, still gambled on a bargain. After all, the salesmen were persuasive, friendly, and often fellow travelers on the rails. A lingering mystery. By the close of the 1890s, police had disrupted several nodes of the swindle but never fully dismantled it. The Chicago import firms continued their trade. Forged certificates still appeared in Pennsylvania towns, and the question remained: was there a central figure coordinating these schemes, or was the swindle a loose confederation of opportunists? Detective Whitman himself, nearing retirement, wrote in a final report, "We chase shadows along the tracks. Each time we believe the heart of it is within reach, it scatters like smoke. Yet the watches keep appearing, as steady as trains themselves." The investigation was far from over. The next stage would bring federal authorities into play, new laws, and unexpected consequences for both swindlers and railroads alike. By the late 1890s, the railroad watch swindle had become more than a nuisance. It was now a matter of national concern. Local police, railroad companies, and watch inspectors had done their best to stem the tide, but the swindle proved resilient. Every time a salesman was arrested, another appeared. Every time a warehouse was raided, a new one emerged in another city. It seemed that the scheme was as mobile as the trains themselves. But the tide was about to shift, thanks to a combination of federal involvement, stricter regulations, and an unlikely alliance between jewelers and railroad executives. The federal step-in. The turning point came in 1898 when the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, received a petition from several major railroads. They argued that fraudulent watches represented a direct threat to interstate commerce and passenger safety. The petition highlighted specific cases: near misses on the Pennsylvania Railroad, delays on the Baltimore and Ohio, and testimony from inspectors who had confiscated dozens of counterfeit timepieces. The ICC agreed to investigate. This was significant. Until then, watch regulation had been a patchwork of railroad rules and local enforcement. Now, for the first time, federal oversight loomed. The commission worked with postal inspectors, men already skilled in uncovering frauds involving the mail. Since many salesmen advertised through newspapers and delivered watches via post, this gave investigators a powerful lever. False advertising, fraudulent certification, and the use of the Postal Service for swindle became federal offenses. The Postmaster General's warning. In 1899, the Postmaster General issued a nationwide warning. Any advertisement claiming railroad-certified watches must provide proof of certification or face penalties for mail fraud. Several small printing presses in Pennsylvania were shut down as a result. Mail-order companies operating from Chicago suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. For the swindlers, this was a serious blow. Their ability to operate under the cloak of anonymity depended heavily on the postal system. Without that, their reach shrank. Jewelers take a stand. At the same time, Legitimate jewelers, long frustrated by the undercutting of fraudulent salesmen, organized more aggressively. The National Association of Jewelers launched a campaign to educate railroad workers on how to recognize genuine railroad standard watches. Pamphlets showed clear diagrams, the position of the regulator, the markings of a reliable movement, and the importance of jeweler certification. They included a phrase that became common in railroad towns: "Buy the inspector, not the watch." The meaning was clear: trust the jeweler who inspects, not the traveling salesman who sells. A landmark arrest. In 1900, federal investigators scored their most significant victory. In Pittsburgh, they arrested Samuel "Sammy" Keene, a former jeweler turned middleman who had coordinated shipments of cheap Swiss movements for nearly a decade. Keene's operation was extensive. He imported low-grade watch parts from Europe, had them assembled in local workshops, and distributed them to traveling salesmen across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. His records, hastily kept in a ledger, revealed connections to more than 50 salesmen operating under aliases. The trial of Keene drew wide attention. Railroad men, jewelers, and inspectors testified to the damage his scheme had caused. Though Keene defended himself by claiming that he sold only what men were willing to buy, the jury was unmoved. He was convicted of fraud and sentenced to several years in federal prison. The public shift. Keene's conviction marked a symbolic shift. Newspapers hailed it as the end of the great watch swindle, though in truth smaller operations continued. Still, the conviction gave railroad companies confidence that law enforcement finally took the issue seriously. From then on, railroad watch inspection became stricter than ever. Inspectors compiled blacklists of suspect watches, distributed to every depot. Workers were warned that owning a questionable timepiece could cost them their jobs. The combination of enforcement, education, and fear gradually eroded the swindle's appeal. A quiet fade. By the first years of the 20th century, the railroad watch swindle had faded. Traveling salesmen no longer found easy buyers. Workers were more cautious, inspectors more vigilant, and laws more punishing. Yet traces of the swindle lingered. Pawnshops across Pennsylvania still carried the telltale cheap movements with false engravings. Some men, embarrassed at being duped, kept their watches as grim souvenirs. Detective Henry Whitman, who had spent much of the 1890s chasing the fraud, reflected in retirement: "We never truly stopped it, we only outlasted it. The rails grew stricter, the men grew wiser, and the swindle ran out of track." The legacy of standard timekeeping. Though the swindle faded, its legacy shaped railroad culture for decades. Standardization of watches. Railroads formalized the list of approved watch models. Only certain makes and grades could be carried by conductors and engineers. Strengthened inspection. Regular inspections became non-negotiable. Inspectors maintained detailed records, and watch certificates became as important as work badges. Public perception. The swindle reinforced the idea that time was not merely money, it was safety. The public began to view precision timekeeping as a symbol of modern reliability. Consumer awareness. Outside the railroads, the scandal taught everyday people to be wary of traveling salesmen and mail-order bargains. A reflection on trust. The story of the railroad watch swindle is not one of spectacular heists or bloody crimes. It is, instead, a quiet tale of deception woven into the fabric of daily life. The men who fell victim did not lose fortunes, but they risked something greater: their livelihoods, their dignity, and in the worst cases, the lives of passengers who depended on their precision. It reminds us that crime does not always roar with violence. Sometimes it whispers through the ticking of a false watch, selling a promise that time itself can be trusted. And the lingering question remains: if the swindle had not been exposed, how many disasters might have unfolded from the simple lie of a slow second hand? Story 6. The Vanished Library Books of Yale, 1963. The year was 1963, a time when the American university campus represented both stability and change. At Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, the libraries were considered sacred ground. Sterling Memorial Library, with its vaulted ceilings and Gothic stonework, stood like a cathedral of knowledge. To walk inside was to step into a hushed world of scholarship, where every shelf carried the weight of centuries. For most students, the library was a place of all-nighters and whispered study groups. But tucked deep inside, far from the undergraduate bustle, were rooms that few outsiders ever saw, the rare book collections. Here, behind locked doors and tall iron gates, rested treasures that told the story not just of Yale, but of human civilization itself. Among them were priceless medieval manuscripts, first editions of English poets, handwritten sermons from the Puritans, and maps from the earliest voyages to the New World. Each volume represented a fragment of history, carefully catalogued, guarded with the solemnity of relics. And yet, as the decade turned, Yale would discover that even the hallowed halls of academia were not immune to crime. The culture of rare books. To understand the thefts that shook Yale in 1963, one must first grasp the allure of rare books in that era. Collectors from wealthy industrialists to eccentric bibliophiles competed fiercely for first editions and manuscripts. Prices were rising steadily, driven not just by scarcity but by prestige. Owning a Shakespeare folio or a Colonial pamphlet was more than an investment. It was a statement of identity. By the early 1960s, a black market in rare books had grown quietly in the shadows. Dealers who could not acquire texts through legitimate means sometimes turned to thieves. Small-town libraries were burglarized. Private collections disappeared in mysterious house fires. And now, it seemed, even Yale's carefully guarded shelves were vulnerable. The first vanishings. The first clue came not with alarms or broken locks, but with silence. In March 1963, a graduate student in history requested to consult a rare sermon book printed in Boston in 1720. The librarian retrieved the call slip, walked to the shelf, and returned empty-handed. At first, the assumption was clerical error. Perhaps the book had been misplaced or set aside for rebinding. The rare book stacks were notoriously complex, with ladders, narrow aisles, and cataloging systems that sometimes lagged behind physical reality. Yet after several days of searching, the book remained missing. Weeks later, a professor sought a colonial map, one of the first printed in North America. Again, the shelf was bare. Again, staff combed through inventory, suspecting oversight. But the map, too, had vanished. One by one, requests began turning up blanks. It was as if Yale's treasures were quietly evaporating. Suspicion grows. At first, administrators hesitated to speak of theft. To admit such a violation seemed unthinkable, but librarians, more practical than proud, began keeping careful tallies. Between March and September 1963, more than 24 items were noted as missing. Not trivial pamphlets, but important works, early American sermons, rare atlases, fragile poetry books. Behind closed doors, suspicion brewed. Could it be an insider, a staff member with keys to the collection? Or perhaps a visiting scholar who had taken advantage of Yale's reputation for hospitality? The library was not a fortress. Graduate students often received special access to rare materials for their dissertations. Professors brought in colleagues from other institutions. Security, by modern standards, was minimal. Sign-in sheets, locked cases, and the trust that academia had long afforded its own. That trust, it seemed, was being betrayed. The world beyond Yale. The vanishings did not occur in isolation. Across the United States in the 1960s, stories circulated of rare books turning up at auctions with dubious provenance. Dealers in New York and Boston whispered about collections that fell off the wagon. Some spoke of a network of thieves who targeted libraries not out of passion for learning, but for profit. Unlike stolen jewels or paintings, books could be harder to trace. A map torn from a volume could be sold individually. A bookplate could be removed. And in an age before digital catalogs, the chances of a small volume being recognized outside its home institution were slim. Thus, Yale's missing books were not just an institutional loss. They represented an entry point into a much wider underworld of cultural theft. A librarian's vigil. One of the earliest figures to sound the alarm was James T. Babb, Yale's head librarian. A dignified man with a sharp eye, Babb had long been devoted to the care of rare books. He had fought to expand Yale's collections, courting donations from wealthy alumni. To him, each book was not just paper and ink, but a piece of Yale's soul. When reports of missing volumes reached his desk, Babb grew concerned. He ordered a discreet internal audit of the rare book holdings. Clerks and librarians were tasked with comparing physical shelves against catalogs, noting discrepancies. What they found was unsettling. The missing items were not random. They clustered around Colonial Americana, a field highly sought after in the collector's market. Whoever was removing them seemed to know exactly what they were doing. The quiet panic. By autumn of 1963, the whispers in the stacks had become impossible to ignore. Librarians spoke in hushed tones about a phantom haunting the rare collections. Graduate students found their requests denied as staff grew more protective. Professors bristled at the restrictions, arguing that access was the lifeblood of scholarship. But Babb and his colleagues knew the stakes. To lose Yale's treasures was to lose more than books. It was to lose fragments of history that could never be replaced. Behind closed doors, the university debated whether to involve the police. Some feared scandal the headlines that might read, "Priceless books stolen from Yale." Others argued that silence would only embolden the thief. In the end, Yale chose discretion. The investigation would remain internal for now, but already suspicion had narrowed. A handful of names began to circulate. Students who lingered too long in the rare book rooms, scholars who had requested more books than usual, and among them, one figure who seemed to draw the most attention. A shadow among scholars. His name was not yet publicly known. To the librarians, he was simply the collector. A graduate student, quiet and intense, with an insatiable interest in early American history. He spent long hours in the reading rooms, sometimes taking notes, sometimes merely leafing through old pages with what seemed to be unusual fascination. No one accused him directly, but Babb, with his cautious instincts, marked the name. He instructed staff to watch closely, to record every request, every book handled. The stage was being set for a confrontation, though in 1963, no one could yet imagine how wide the scandal would grow, or how many books would vanish before it ended. Closing reflection. The story of Yale's vanished library books began not with smashed locks or midnight break-ins, but with something subtler: the quiet absence of a book from a shelf, a request unanswered, a suspicion whispered in the stacks. And as the list of missing items grew, so too did the realization. This was not the work of chance, but of intention. Someone was stealing Yale's past, one volume at a time. The lingering question was chilling. How deep did the theft run, and how long had the phantom been among them? The library of Yale University was never meant to feel like a crime scene. Its Gothic arches, carved stone doorways, and oak-paneled reading rooms were built to inspire awe, not suspicion. Yet by late 1963, an invisible tension clung to the air inside Sterling Memorial Library. Every missing book was a wound, and every visitor became a potential suspect. A growing list. The audit ordered by head librarian James T. Babb revealed what many had feared. The thefts were not isolated incidents. By December of that year, the tally of missing items had climbed beyond 50. Among them were volumes of sermons from the Great Awakening, an early printing of Increase Mather's works, and pamphlets from the earliest days of the American colonies. These were not just curiosities. To scholars of early America, they were primary evidence documents that carried the voices of the 17th and 18th centuries. The loss meant more than money. It meant the erasure of historical record. Even worse, the missing books showed a clear pattern. The thief was targeting early American imprints with precision, bypassing works of lesser value and zeroing in on the most significant. The suspect pool narrows. The librarians knew one thing for certain: the thief was no ordinary intruder. The rare book room was locked at all times, and entry required signing a register. Whoever was responsible had the appearance of a scholar. They knew how to request volumes, how to handle fragile texts, and perhaps most importantly, how to avoid drawing suspicion. Among the staff, a few names began to circulate more frequently. One student in particular caught their attention. He was a doctoral candidate in American history, a man in his early 30s, quiet, polite, and almost painfully meticulous. He requested dozens of Colonial books each month, often sitting for hours in the rare book room without producing much visible research. Librarians whispered about the way his hands lingered over the bindings, the way he studied title pages as though memorizing them. For now, they had no proof, only a name in the register and a feeling in their gut. A clash of priorities. Inside the administration, a debate raged. Some senior officials pressed to bring in the police. Others insisted that such a move would be disastrous. To admit that Yale, guardian of priceless cultural heritage, had been robbed, and repeatedly, might expose the university to ridicule. Alumni might question the stewardship of their donations. Scholars might take their work elsewhere. James Babb, ever protective of Yale's reputation, argued for caution. He believed they could quietly tighten security without drawing headlines. For months, he tried exactly that, restricting access, tightening audits, and instructing staff to watch more closely. But the books kept disappearing. The nature of rare book theft. Part of the problem lay in the very nature of rare book theft. Unlike jewelry or paintings, books could be stolen in plain sight. A slim pamphlet could slide under a jacket. A map could be folded into a portfolio. Even larger books could be carried openly if no one thought to question why. And unlike a diamond or painting, a rare book could be disguised. Bookplates could be cut out. Bindings could be altered. Once stripped of its institutional markings, a stolen volume could slip into the open market with alarming ease. For the librarians at Yale, this meant that every missing book might already be gone, forever absorbed into private collections, or resold to dealers who would never guess its origin. A private network. What Yale staff did not yet fully grasp was that they were facing not just a thief, but an entire network. By the early 1960s, rare book dealers in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia quietly traded in materials of dubious origin. Collectors asked few questions. The line between legitimate acquisition and theft was blurry, and enforcement was almost non-existent. In this environment, a skilled thief could thrive. Yale's missing volumes might already have been scattered across auction houses, dealer catalogs, or wealthy private libraries. The books had left New Haven, but their trail remained invisible. Watching the phantom. Inside the rare book room, the librarians began to keep closer watch on the suspect student. They noted his requests. They observed his movements. One staff member recalled later how he would cradle a Colonial pamphlet almost lovingly, turning its fragile pages with care, yet never seeming to write notes or produce drafts. Still, the librarians hesitated to confront him. Without direct evidence, they feared a scandal that might destroy not only his career, but also Yale's own reputation. Instead, they hoped vigilance might deter him, but vigilance, it seemed, was not enough. A break in the pattern. In the spring of 1964, something unusual happened. Among the missing items was a volume far less valuable than the others, a relatively ordinary colonial sermon, worth only a fraction of the great atlases or pamphlets previously targeted. This puzzled Bab and his staff. Why would the thief who had shown such careful selectivity suddenly choose something so minor? Was it an act of carelessness, a test, or simply opportunism? Whatever the reason, the theft suggested something new. The thief was growing bolder. The librarian's dilemma. By now, Yale faced an impossible dilemma. The losses were mounting. The list of missing books stretched to well over 100, yet the administration still refused to go public. The librarians, caught between duty and discretion, felt increasingly helpless. They wanted to protect Yale's treasures, but without the power to search, question, or prosecute, they could only watch as the shelves grew barer. One described the feeling as tending a garden while someone uproots the plants at night. A broader rumor. Meanwhile, word began to spread beyond Yale. At book fairs and auctions, whispers circulated of early American pamphlets with suspiciously clean title pages, no library markings, no provenance. Dealers asked quietly whether Yale had lost track of some of its collection. Bab, when approached, denied everything. To admit otherwise would be to expose Yale to embarrassment. But privately, he knew the truth. Yale's rare book room had been compromised. A student out of place. Among the many scholars who drifted through Yale's libraries, the suspect student stood out for another reason: his background. Unlike most doctoral candidates, he was not fresh from college but older, with a previous career behind him. He carried himself with confidence, even when sitting silently for hours. Some librarians felt uneasy around him. His eyes lingered too long, not just on books but on the staff themselves. He asked questions about cataloging, about access, about how Yale obtained its volumes. Questions that seemed less about scholarship and more about opportunity. Though they did not yet know it, they were dealing with one of the most notorious rare book thieves of the 20th century. The trap is set. By late 1964, after another year of quiet losses, Bab and his colleagues began to accept that discretion was no longer enough. Something had to change. Yale could not sustain the hemorrhage. Plans were made to monitor the rare book room more aggressively. Access logs were scrutinized with greater care. Staff began quietly marking certain books in ways that would reveal tampering. The librarians, it seemed, were preparing for confrontation. The phantom in the reading room would not be allowed to drift unseen forever. Closing reflection. By 1964, Yale's rare book thefts were no longer a whisper but a crisis. The university had lost not dozens but hundreds of items, each one irreplaceable. And though suspicions had narrowed to a single figure, proof remained elusive. It left Yale in an uneasy stalemate: guardians who could not accuse, and a thief who moved with impunity among them. The question lingered: when would Yale finally act, and how far had the phantom already gone? By the mid-1960s, Sterling Memorial Library was carrying a secret heavier than many of the books that lined its shelves. More than 300 volumes had vanished. Each one represented an irreplaceable fragment of American history. And though the librarians suspected one man above all, they still lacked proof strong enough to bring him down. That would soon change. The profile of a thief. The man in question was James Richard Shinn, a graduate student in American history. To many, he appeared entirely ordinary, quiet, bookish, with an intense focus on his studies. He spoke politely, dressed modestly, and seemed to embody the seriousness expected of a Yale scholar. But beneath that exterior lay an obsession not with knowledge, but with possession. Shinn was consumed by a desire to own what others could only study. To him, the rare books of Yale's collection were not communal treasures, but prizes waiting to be claimed. This psychology, sometimes called bibliomania, had a long history. Throughout the centuries, Men had been known to steal books not for profit but for the satisfaction of hoarding. Shin was part of this tradition, though his thefts also fed the bustling black market in rare American works. Methods in the shadows. Shin's methods were clever, if not ingenious. He requested volumes from the rare book room, carried them to his desk, and at moments when the staff were distracted, he slipped them into his coat or briefcase. For smaller pamphlets, he sometimes concealed them in his notes. To obscure his trail, he removed bookplates and cataloging slips. In some cases, he sliced out identifying stamps with a razor blade. What emerged was a clean book, one that could pass as a volume from any private collection. Shin then resold some of these works to dealers in New York and Boston. Others he hoarded for himself. It was a double life: diligent graduate student by day, clandestine trafficker in cultural heritage by night. The first break. The librarian's plan to mark volumes bore fruit in 1965. A colonial pamphlet with a hidden identifying mark, invisible to the casual eye, turned up missing. Months later, the same pamphlet surfaced in the catalog of a rare book dealer. When Yale quietly inquired, the dealer explained that the item had been sold to him by none other than James Shin. The trail was becoming clear. Still, Babb and the administration hesitated. To accuse a graduate student outright risked scandal. They needed ironclad proof. The net tightens. Over the next year, Yale cooperated discreetly with investigators. The FBI was drawn in, as the theft of cultural property across state lines made the matter a federal case. Agents began tracing sales records, visiting dealers, and matching Yale's missing books against items appearing on the open market. The evidence piled up. Shin's name appeared again and again. Some dealers, when pressed, admitted that his offerings had seemed suspiciously frequent for a mere graduate student. One recalled asking, "Where do you find such things?" and receiving only a vague smile in return. By late 1967, investigators were ready to act. The confrontation. On a cold December morning, Shin was called into a private meeting at Sterling Memorial. Waiting for him were representatives from Yale's administration, law enforcement, and the FBI. The confrontation was quiet, almost anticlimactic. Shin denied the charges at first, but when presented with documents, sales receipts, matching catalogs, and even his own handwriting on dealer slips, his composure faltered. In the end, he confessed to taking dozens of books, though the true number ran far higher. The arrest. In 1968, Shin was formally arrested and charged with multiple counts of interstate transportation of stolen property. The case made headlines across the academic world. "Graduate student accused of plundering Yale library," read one headline. Another asked bluntly, "Who guards the guardians of knowledge?" For Yale, the embarrassment was profound. A trusted scholar in training had exploited their generosity and violated the sanctity of their collection. For librarians everywhere, the case was a chilling reminder of how vulnerable even the most secure repositories could be. The trial. Shin's trial revealed the staggering scope of his thefts. Investigators estimated he had stolen over 400 rare volumes, making him one of the most prolific book thieves in American history. Dealers testified about the books he had sold them. Librarians detailed the losses. Experts explained the cultural devastation, how some items were so rare that losing them meant severing direct ties to America's earliest history. Shin, for his part, seemed oddly detached. He spoke of his love of books, as though his passion justified the betrayal. The court did not agree. He was convicted and sentenced to prison, though his term was relatively light compared to the scale of the crime, a reflection of the era's limited legal framework for dealing with cultural theft. The aftermath for Yale. Yale was left to pick up the pieces. Of the hundreds of stolen books, only a fraction were recovered. Some were returned by dealers who wished to avoid bad publicity. Others were tracked down through FBI raids, but many vanished into private collections, never to be seen again. The university quietly overhauled its security. Access to the rare bookroom became far more restricted. Visitors were monitored closely, and new systems for cataloging and marking volumes were introduced. The lesson had been learned at great cost. Trust alone could no longer guard the treasures of history. A wider reckoning. The case also reverberated beyond Yale. Libraries across the country, Harvard, Princeton, the Library of Congress began reassessing their procedures. Dealers grew more cautious about provenance, demanding clearer records before purchasing rare volumes. For the first time, book theft was recognized as not just an academic nuisance, but a serious cultural crime. The FBI even began building a database of stolen works, a precursor to modern registries of missing art and manuscripts. Shin's legacy. After serving his sentence, James Shin faded into obscurity. His academic career was ruined. His name became synonymous with betrayal among librarians. Yet his crimes had an unintended effect. They forced the scholarly world to take book theft seriously. In a sense, he reshaped the way institutions thought about security, preservation, and trust. But the losses remained. Even today, lists circulate of Yale volumes last seen before 1963, marked forever as missing. Each one is a ghost, a reminder of how fragile cultural memory can be. A reflection. The story of James Shin and the vanished books of Yale is not a tale of violence or bloodshed. It is a quieter crime, one that unfolded in whispers across reading rooms and rare book catalogs. Yet its consequences were profound. It reminds us that crime does not always shout. Sometimes it tiptoes, leaving silence in its wake. And it asks us a lingering question. How do we guard the treasures of knowledge when the danger may come from those we trust the most? Story 7. The Counterfeit Button Makers of Paris. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Paris stood as the beating heart of Europe's fashion and trade. The boulevards rang with the clatter of carriages, the salons filled with artists and intellectuals, and the markets overflowed with silks, perfumes, and luxuries. Yet among all these glittering commodities, there was one small object that carried enormous weight: the button. The button as currency of fashion. To modern eyes, a button may seem trivial, a mere fastening device. But in Paris during this period, buttons were symbols of class, wealth, and refinement. They adorned the waistcoats of gentlemen, the bodices of ladies, and the uniforms of soldiers. Buttons were crafted from ivory, brass, enamel, porcelain, even silver and gold. Some were decorated with miniature portraits or delicate enameling, tiny works of art in themselves. The wealthy collected and displayed buttons the way others collected medals or jewels. Owning a set of rare Parisian buttons could signify taste, power, and social position. Entire guilds were devoted to their production. And as with anything valuable, crime soon followed. The rise of counterfeiters. By the turn of the 19th century, the demand for fashionable buttons outpaced legitimate production. Into this gap stepped counterfeiters, artisans who mimicked the guilds' craftsmanship but cut corners with cheaper materials. Instead of ivory, they used bone. Instead of silver, they used tin coated in quicksilver. Instead of fine enameling, they painted crude imitations. The counterfeiters worked in back alleys and cramped workshops, often at night to avoid detection. Their goods flowed into markets, where unsuspecting buyers or sometimes willing accomplices passed them off as genuine. The profit margins were staggering. A button worth 10 francs in a fashionable shop might cost less than a single franc to manufacture illicitly. Soon, entire networks sprang up. Makers, distributors, and sellers, each playing their part in Paris's hidden economy of fraud. The guilds strike back. The legitimate button makers, organized into powerful guilds, saw their livelihoods under siege. These guilds were centuries old, regulated by strict statutes, with apprenticeships lasting years. A button stamped with the guild's approval carried the weight of tradition and authenticity. So when counterfeiters flooded the market, guild masters raised alarms. They petitioned city officials, arguing that counterfeiting not only robbed them of income but threatened the reputation of Parisian craftsmanship itself. After all, Paris's luxury exports were central to France's economy. If buyers abroad suspected fraud, entire markets could collapse. In response, authorities launched crackdowns. Raids swept through known districts, workshops were seized, and counterfeit goods destroyed. Yet the trade proved resilient. Like weeds, counterfeiters sprang up faster than they could be cut down. The market of Les Halles. To understand how counterfeit buttons thrived, one must picture the great market of Les Halles, Paris's bustling commercial center. Here, amid stalls of food, cloth, and trinkets, buttons passed hand to hand. Street vendors hawked them openly, some authentic, others not. Buyers often couldn't tell the difference. For the poor, counterfeit buttons were a blessing. They allowed working-class Parisians to imitate the fashions of their betters. For soldiers and clerks on modest wages, they provided affordable uniform replacements. Counterfeiters tapped into this demand, justifying their work as a service to the people. But for the wealthy and for the guilds, they were parasites undermining the prestige of French industry. Early investigations. The Paris police, already well practiced in handling forgers of coins and documents, now turned their attention to buttons. Reports survive of inspectors tracing shipments of suspicious goods, interviewing market sellers, and attempting to infiltrate workshops. Some counterfeiters were caught red-handed. In one recorded case from the early 1800s, a group of artisans was discovered producing imitation enamel buttons in a cellar, their work so crude that the colors flaked off after a few weeks of wear. They were fined heavily, and their stock was confiscated. But others were far more skilled. Certain counterfeiters became so adept that even seasoned guild masters struggled to distinguish their products from genuine ones. These cases stoked paranoia. Buyers began to doubt even legitimate shops. The shadow economy expands. By the 1820s and 1830s, the counterfeit button trade had taken on a life of its own. Some groups operated almost like criminal guilds themselves, with apprenticeships, codes of silence, and carefully guarded secrets of production. Distribution networks reached beyond Paris, sending fake buttons to Lyon, Marseille, and even across borders to Belgium and Germany. Paris had become not only a capital of fashion, but also a capital of deception. Authorities continued their raids, but the counterfeiters adapted, moving locations frequently and disguising their operations as legitimate trades. A workshop might appear to produce ordinary household items by day, while secretly producing counterfeit buttons by night. The human cost. For all its intrigue, the counterfeit trade had a darker side. Many counterfeiters employed child labor, exploiting orphans and the desperately poor. Children were tasked with polishing metal, applying toxic paints, or cutting bone. Exposure to mercury and lead in the enameling process left lasting health effects. Meanwhile, honest apprentices in the guild struggled to find work, as demand for authentic buttons declined. Families that had produced buttons for generations suddenly faced ruin. In this way, the counterfeit trade was not just a crime of deception, but a blow to entire communities. A culture of imitation. Yet despite the harm, counterfeit buttons also reflected a broader cultural phenomenon in Paris, the obsession with imitation. In fashion, food, and art, imitation often blurred into admiration. Cheaper versions of luxury goods allowed the masses to feel connected to the elegance of the elite. Thus, the counterfeit button makers walked a thin line between criminality and cultural service. Some even defended themselves openly, claiming that they democratized beauty. Was it truly theft, they argued, if they brought fine designs within reach of ordinary people? This moral ambiguity complicated enforcement. While officials cracked down on the trade, many Parisians turned a blind eye, happy to benefit from the bargains. A gathering storm. By the mid-19th century, the counterfeit button problem had grown so large that it became a matter of state concern. French exports risked losing credibility abroad. Newspapers began reporting scandals, with stories of foreign merchants returning shipments of Parisian buttons that turned out to be worthless fakes. The government faced a dilemma. How could they safeguard the reputation of French craftsmanship while also acknowledging the demand that fueled counterfeiting? Stronger laws were proposed. Police surveillance increased. But the counterfeiters were entrenched, clever, and motivated by profits too rich to abandon. Paris was bracing for a struggle that would pit tradition against deception, guild against underworld, and the pride of a nation against the quiet ingenuity of its counterfeiters. An open question. As the 19th century pressed forward, Paris found itself at a crossroads. Could the guilds and the state root out the counterfeit button makers, or would the shadow economy simply become another permanent feature of the city's life? And perhaps the deeper question lingered still. Were the counterfeiters mere criminals, or were they in their own way artisans of survival, reflecting the hunger of a society caught between luxury and poverty? The counterfeit button trade was no longer a whisper in back alleys. By the 1830s, it had become an open secret, feeding the wardrobes of soldiers, clerks, and even minor aristocrats who craved the prestige of fashionable accessories without paying the guild's prices. With profits swelling, networks grew bolder, and police were forced to escalate their fight against what had become one of Paris's most stubborn illicit industries. The raid in the Rue du Temple. One of the most famous incidents occurred in 1834, when inspectors stormed a workshop in the Rue du Temple, a narrow street known for artisans of all trades. Acting on a tip from a disgruntled apprentice, police descended on a cellar where counterfeiters had set up presses, dyes, and vats of enamel paint. Inside, they discovered nearly 5,000 counterfeit buttons, some gilded to resemble military insignia, others crudely painted imitations of fashionable enamel sets. The operation was larger than anyone expected. But what shocked officials most was not the quantity, but the clientele list found scribbled in a ledger. Names included tailors, small merchants, and even army supply officers. Counterfeits weren't just filtering through markets, they were embedded in supply chains that fed the state itself. The raid resulted in several arrests, yet the ringleader slipped away. Some whispered he had bribed his way to freedom. The raid embarrassed the authorities, who were forced to admit the counterfeiters. Reach extended into institutions meant to be guardians of order. The guild's fury. The button makers' guild, already under pressure from industrial changes, erupted in anger. To them, counterfeiting was an existential threat, undermining both their economic survival and their honor. They demanded harsher laws and more aggressive enforcement. Guild masters testified before magistrates, waving samples of authentic and counterfeit buttons side by side. This, they argued, isn't merely a crime of fraud. It is the erosion of French artistry, a poison in our proud tradition. Yet critics pointed out that guild prices were exorbitant, and their rigid rules excluded countless would-be artisans. Counterfeiting thrived partly because the guilds left no room for flexibility. Thus, the authorities were caught in a bind: defend the guilds or acknowledge the counterfeiters as a byproduct of monopolistic control. The counterfeiters' ingenuity. For every raid, counterfeiters adapted. Some rented rooms under false names, moving operations every few weeks. Others disguised their workshops as legitimate trades. A cellar might appear to be a wine storehouse until inspectors pried open barrels to find dyes and molds hidden beneath false bottoms. Perhaps the most ingenious ploy involved the Seine. Counterfeiters began transporting shipments of buttons downriver on makeshift rafts or hidden in cargo barges. When police patrols tightened, smugglers used floating casks with ropes tethered beneath boats, invisible from above. If confronted, they could simply cut the rope, letting evidence drift downstream. The river became a liquid highway for illicit trade, frustrating inspectors who struggled to monitor every bend and dock. Soldiers and buttons. Military uniforms created both opportunity and scandal. Soldiers were required to maintain their coats with polished brass or gilded buttons, often expensive to replace. Counterfeiters capitalized, producing near-perfect imitations at a fraction of the price. Soon, whole regiments were unknowingly marching in counterfeit brass. The problem became so widespread that officers petitioned the Ministry of War. Discipline, they argued, is undermined when the uniform itself is degraded. Investigations revealed collusion. Supply officers had accepted bribes or kickbacks from counterfeit networks, ordering fake buttons in bulk. What began as petty fraud had now entangled the military, threatening both honor and efficiency. Courtrooms and consequences. When counterfeiters were caught, trials became spectacles. Newspapers reported lurid details, describing seized workshops and the cunning tricks used to deceive buyers. In one case, a counterfeiter attempted to argue that his wares were imitations, not forgeries, and that customers willingly bought them as cheaper alternatives. His defense mirrored a growing sentiment. Was imitation truly theft, or simply another form of commerce? Magistrates rarely bought the argument. Sentences ranged from heavy fines to imprisonment in Paris's notorious prisons like Saint-Pélagie. But the public often sympathized with counterfeiters, seeing them as craftsmen punished for competing with greedy guilds. Women in the trade. Interestingly, women played a surprising role in the counterfeit button economy. While most workshops were male-dominated, many women worked as polishers, painters, or market sellers. Some became skilled intermediaries, ferrying goods between workshops and stalls, their baskets appearing to carry bread or cloth while hiding glittering buttons beneath. Police reports mentioned several female ringleaders who orchestrated networks from modest apartments. They exploited stereotypes, the assumption that women were peripheral to crime to move freely under less suspicion. In reality, some were as ruthless and organized as their male counterparts. The international spread. As Paris cracked down, counterfeiters began exporting. Shipments of buttons turned up in Brussels, Amsterdam, and London, where merchants were both amused and infuriated by the French imitations. In Britain, newspapers mocked the false Parisian shine, but acknowledged the cleverness of the forgers. Ironically, some counterfeit buttons became collectible in their own right. Historians today note that certain counterfeit sets, identifiable by quirks in design, are preserved in museums as curiosities of crime. The line between fraud and art blurred further. The case of the vanishing workshop. One particularly baffling case occurred in 1842. Police received intelligence about a major counterfeit ring operating in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. When they raided the address, they found an empty space, walls freshly whitewashed, no trace of machinery. Neighbors reported men working night and day for months, then disappearing overnight. Where had they gone? No one could say. Some suspected advance warning, perhaps from corrupt officials. Others whispered about underground passages leading to new workshops. The vanishing workshop became a symbol of the counterfeiters, elusiveness ghosts in the city's labyrinth. Public opinion shifts. By mid-century, attitudes toward counterfeiting were conflicted. On one hand, the government insisted it was a corrosive crime. On the other, many Parisians saw counterfeiters as folk heroes, clever artisans, outsmarting rigid guilds and aloof officials. Pamphlets circulated romanticizing their ingenuity, painting them as rebels against elitism. The authorities, meanwhile, grew desperate. Each raid seemed to reveal not decline but expansion. The counterfeiters were no longer ragtag artisans, but organized networks with influence, wealth, and the ability to embarrass the state. Toward a tipping point. By the late 1840s, counterfeit button makers had become so entrenched that Paris faced a genuine crisis of legitimacy. Could the government continue to present itself as the steward of French craftsmanship if even its soldiers wore fake brass? Could the guilds survive if every fashionable salon risked exposure for flaunting counterfeits? It was becoming clear. The counterfeit button trade was not a nuisance to be stamped out, but a systemic challenge, one that blurred the lines between survival, rebellion, and criminality. Unresolved questions. As Paris teetered between crackdowns and concessions, a question hung in the air. Were the counterfeit button makers merely parasites draining the lifeblood of French artistry? Or were they innovators who revealed the fragility of a system built on exclusivity and class? And most pressing of all, if the state could not control something as small as a button, what did that say about its ability to govern the greater machinery of a rapidly changing society? The turning of the tide. By the early 1850s, Paris was shifting under the weight of industrialization. The rise of mass manufacturing, larger workshops powered by steam, increasingly mechanized processes, and a loosening of guild authority began to erode the unique economic environment that had allowed counterfeit button makers to thrive. Guilds themselves, once the fiercest opponents of counterfeiting, were weakening. Industrial competition made their rigid price controls and standards harder to enforce. The state began to view guilds as outdated relics in need of reform. But ironically, this shift did not immediately end counterfeiting. Instead, it created a temporary vacuum. With guild protections fading and industrial oversight not yet fully established, counterfeiters continued to exploit gaps. Yet their power was no longer absolute. The government was determined to make a final stand. The Great Trial of 1852. That determination culminated in the so-called Great Trial of 1852, when more than 24 alleged counterfeit button makers were arrested in coordinated raids across the Marais, Saint-Antoine, and the left bank. Police had quietly investigated for months, embedding informants in markets and tracing shipments along the Seine. When the raids came, they struck with precision, seizing presses, molds, barrels of enamel, and hundreds of thousands of buttons in various stages of completion. The trial that followed was one of the longest of its kind in Paris's criminal courts. Witnesses included tailors, guild representatives, soldiers, and even merchants from London who had bought counterfeit buttons unknowingly. The accused were portrayed not as petty thieves, but as members of a dangerous network undermining the integrity of French commerce. Newspapers feasted on the spectacle, publishing courtroom sketches of defendants defiantly holding up counterfeit buttons as if to prove their craft. The sentences were severe. Several ringleaders received multi-year prison terms, others were fined ruinous amounts, and a few were consigned to hard labor in colonies. Authorities hailed the trial as the death blow to the counterfeit button trade. Did it truly end? Despite the triumphalism, counterfeiters did not vanish overnight. Smaller operations persisted, hidden deeper underground. Some shifted to new ventures: counterfeit coins, fake jewelry, forged documents. Others emigrated, taking their craft to Belgium or even across the Atlantic, where burgeoning cities like New York and New Orleans provided fertile ground for illicit artisans. What changed most was visibility. After the Great Trial, counterfeiters could no longer flaunt their wares in markets with impunity. Fear of police raids drove them into the shadows, and as industrial factories flooded Paris with cheaper, machine-made buttons, the demand for counterfeit artisanal versions waned. By the 1860s, counterfeiting buttons was no longer a central feature of Parisian underworld life. But the memory lingered, a curious chapter in the city's struggle between tradition and modernization. The social echo. The counterfeit button saga left behind more than broken molds and empty workshops. It altered the way Parisians thought about crime and commerce. Legitimacy and fraud. Many observers realized that the counterfeiters thrived not simply out of greed, but because ordinary citizens wanted affordable goods. Fraud and legitimacy were not separate worlds. They were bound together by demand. The question of craft. Some counterfeit buttons were of such high quality that experts could barely tell them apart from legitimate guild products. Did this mean the counterfeiters were criminals, or artisans denied recognition? In later years, art historians would re-examine confiscated counterfeit sets, noting their beauty and craftsmanship, a strange irony that blurred the line between crime and creativity. Policing innovation. The state learned painful lessons in surveillance and enforcement. Raids on workshops, infiltration of networks, and maritime inspections along the Seine became case studies in evolving urban policing. These tactics later influenced how Paris dealt with other forms of organized crime, from smuggling to anarchist conspiracies. Echoes in literature and art. Writers of the period occasionally referenced the counterfeiters in novels and essays. Honoré de Balzac, fascinated by Paris's underworld, included allusions to counterfeit trades in his sprawling Comédie Humaine, painting a city where every alley contained duplicity. Satirical pamphlets poked fun at the hypocrisy of officials who condemned counterfeiters while themselves profiting from corrupt contracts. Even caricaturists joined in. Lithographs depicted police officers chasing button makers through crooked alleys, buttons spilling comically onto cobblestones. Humor softened the crime's menace, turning counterfeiters into cultural archetypes, tricksters, rebels, craftsmen gone rogue. From buttons to brands. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the counterfeit button trade lies in how it prefigured modern anxieties about imitation and authenticity. The guilds, outrage at imitation, foreshadowed the fierce battles fought over trademarks and luxury branding in later centuries. Just as counterfeit buttons threatened the honor of French craftsmanship, counterfeit handbags, perfumes, and clothing would spark outrage in the 20th and 21st centuries. The button makers were, in a sense, early participants in the global story of intellectual property crime. The forgotten victims. One element often overlooked in retellings is the plight of workers caught in the crossfire. Apprentices arrested alongside ringleaders, women who served as couriers, and small market sellers often bore the brunt of punishment, while wealthier financiers behind the trade escaped. Court records reveal cases of young men imprisoned for years for polishing counterfeit brass, while shadowy merchants melted back into anonymity. The unevenness of justice mirrored broader inequities in Parisian society, reminding us that crime and punishment rarely balanced on equal scales. A reflection on scale. Looking back, one might ask, why did buttons matter so much? They were small objects, easily overlooked. Yet the entire affair illuminates something larger, how even the tiniest tokens of fashion and necessity can carry immense social weight. Buttons were not merely fasteners. They were symbols of class, identity, and honor. To counterfeit them was to counterfeit order itself, to blur the divisions between soldier and civilian, rich and poor, authentic and false. The last arrests. By the late 1860s, scattered reports of counterfeit button arrests still surfaced in Parisian newspapers, but always as curiosities, not crises. The era of sprawling workshops and brazen markets was gone. Industrial uniformity had done what raids could not. It undercut the counterfeiter's niche. The last recorded major arrest, in 1868, involved an elderly craftsman caught with a trunk of brass buttons in a Saint-Denis garret. He confessed to having worked the trade since boyhood. His capture was reported with nostalgia rather than fear, a relic of a bygone Paris, more curiosity than menace. The legacy in today's Paris. Today, if you wander through Parisian flea markets or browse antique shops, you may stumble upon boxes of 19th-century buttons. Some are authentic guild products, others counterfeit survivors whose history is lost to time. Unless you are a specialist, you might never know the difference. That ambiguity is the final lesson of the counterfeit button makers. Authenticity is fragile, always subject to perception, demand, and power. A button once condemned as fraudulent may now be admired as heritage. Crime and culture intertwine, reshaping each other across generations.